Chapter 569. After passing through a series of intersecting tunnels filled with grain and water, Jill soon found the place where the three mysterious men had buried their treasure. In the narrow tunnel, a large bag lay quietly on the ground. Jill and Boo's eyes lit up. "Jill, shall we open it?" "Of course." The two of them untied the ropes in a flurry, but the first thing that was revealed from the cloth bag was not the dazzling treasure, but a young girl with a face as white as a sheet of paper and eyes tightly shut. The two of them screamed in unison and retreated as if they had seen a ghost. "Jill, this is not a treasure." "Of course I know." "Oh my God, this must be a murder." "Martha above, this happened right under her nose." "God is my witness, I didn't do anything." "Boo, quickly pull me up. I'm so scared that my legs are weak." "Jill, I'm the same. Not only are my legs weak, even my back is weak," Boo said with a long face. This was the first time he had seen a dead person. "Don't talk nonsense, Boo. How can your back be weak?" "It's true, Jill. It's so soft. I can even feel that the wall behind me has become soft." "Nonsense, how can the wall become soft?" "It's true. Besides, I said it was just an illusion." Boo replied angrily when he saw that his companions did not want to believe him. But before he could finish his sentence, a gentle voice spoke from behind him. "I think it's not an illusion. Just because you're leaning on my leg." "Ah!" Boo screamed in fright. He turned around and saw a young man wearing a black noble's attire and a long sword at his waist. He looked gentle and kind standing behind him. Both Boo and Jill jumped up at the same time. Meeting a noble in this godforsaken place was like a mouse meeting a cat. Both of them were stunned. This has nothing to do with us, we just met by chance, please don't take us to the port." I'm just saying, please don't accuse a good person." Jill trembled as she looked at the stranger who had appeared without a sound. Although he was daring, the punishment for murder in Ampere Seal had always been severe. The punishment for murder was stripping Ampere Seal of citizenship, confiscation of all family assets, and hanging. Of course, the most severe of all was the confiscation of all property, at least as far as Jill and Boo were concerned. This was simply a punishment straight to hell. The young man who appeared out of nowhere was naturally Brando. Since half of his soul came from the future, he naturally knew about the underground tunnel under the Holy Sanctum. The tunnel was designed and built together with the Anderla Sanctum by Roganin. The tunnel was originally designed as a fortification under the Sanctum, but the Sanctum later used it to do many shady things. The entrance and key to the underground tunnel should be in the hands of the Archbishop. Naturally, ordinary people would not be able to enter. Unfortunately, there was a quest in the Amber Sword that was related to this tunnel, so there was an extra entrance to this tunnel. This unknown entrance was connected to a sewer, and was one of the back doors left behind by Roganin. During the attack and defense of Ampere Seal, the players on Erwin's side used this secret entrance many times to repeatedly attack the Anderla Sanctum, which was under the control of Madara. Therefore, this secret tunnel was once known as the lifeline of the Sanctum. However, in this era, the descendant of the Roganin family who provided the quest should still be living in Grey Harbor, waiting for the call of fate. Brando had reason to believe that no one other than himself would know about this secret tunnel. Therefore, when he saw Jill and Boo, he was still surprised. He originally thought that Princess Magadol might also have the key to this tunnel. With her status, this princess had the opportunity to make a copy of the key. Although this was not in line with her identity, Brando could more or less guess this point from the confident attitude of this princess in front of him. However, he did not expect to meet a pair of greater fairies. He was very familiar with the greater fairies. It could be said that they were the hotbed of rogues. Many of the famous nightingales among the players were also from this race. When they appeared here, Brando immediately knew what they were here for. He was truly audacious. At this time, Freya walked out from behind Brando. The first thing she saw was, of course, the two noisy little guys. She could not help but be stunned. "Brando, why are there two goblins?" "No, we are not goblins. We are fairies." Jill was furious. He could endure being hanged, but he absolutely could not tolerate being slandered as a goblin. Although in Wond, goblins and fairies were indeed big families of goblins, but fairies absolutely disdained to be associated with dirty goblins. In their view, goblins were all cavemen, or rather, cavemen were the ancestors of goblins. "Fairies? Aren't fairies small?" The future Valkyrie even gestured with her hand. She meant to say, "Aren't fairies only 1 or 2 inches tall? They even have beautiful wings." "Those are forest fairies, we are greater fairies." Jill replied indignantly, but his tone could not help but be a little depressed. Just like how fairies looked at goblins, greater fairies were indeed a few levels lower in terms of bloodline compared to the forest fairies. I see, Freya nodded but suddenly saw the bag on the back of the two greater fairies. Her face paled. Princess Magadol. Brando's expression also changed. Without waiting for Jill to speak, he separated the two and pressed his hand on Princess Antiburo's neck. Her body was cold but still soft, but he could no longer feel her pulse. Brando had learned first aid from Freya, so of course he knew what this meant. But he did not give up and called up a virtual screen to take a look. Suddenly his heart turned cold. A line of cold words appeared on the screen. Name, Magadol Armand Loder de Antiburo race. Gender, female status. Dead. The sword wound was in the heart, almost piercing through the chest. If a human received such an injury, even if they had 1 foot in the elemental realm, they would definitely die, not to mention Princess Magadol, who was just an ordinary person. Brando's hand trembled slightly and his face darkened. He had not interacted much with Princess Magadol, whether it was in this world or in the game. But this nun princess had left a very good impression on him. She was gentle, courteous, and did not have the usual bad habits of a noble lady. She was not old-fashioned and cold and even a little hospitable. The most commendable thing was that she did not pick up any bad habits in the circle of scheming nobles. Even in the darkest days of Erewhon and the Holy Cathedral, she still maintained the purest of heart. People who were firm in their beliefs for the sake of friendship were few and far between, even in the more advanced modern society. Princess Antiburo may be a believer, but she believed in the true truth, the most glorious side of the human heart. Freya silently squatted down beside Brando. This was not the first person to be sacrificed in this political battle, but it was the person she was most familiar with. And the princess's best friend, who was usually kind and gentle, was now lying there coldly as a corpse. This kind of shock made her bite her lips tightly. Brando sighed and reached out to smooth the princess's messy hair, trying to make her look as peaceful as possible. Brando? The future goddess of war's voice trembled. It was not that she had never seen death, but she could not understand why people would kill each other to this extent. To the Holy Cathedral, wasn't the nun princess the most devout believer? Brando shook his head and his heart was filled with doubts. This result was also beyond his expectations. In his mind, even if Magadol was exposed, she would at most be put under house arrest. How could the other party do such a thing? How could they dare to do such a thing? The intensity of the other party's reaction was beyond his expectations. But he could not make sense of it at the moment and his heart was in a mess. In the eyes of others, he was never a rational person who was cold to the point of indifference. This was the complete opposite of the nobles in this land. The nobles appreciated this kind of cold rationality, and even thought that it was an outstanding trait that a good lord should have. But he did not fit in with this trait. After a long time he finally came back to his senses. He turned around and stared coldly at Butt and Jill. Look at what you two have done. You have murdered a princess of another country on Erewhon's land. Do you know how big of a mistake you have made? You may even start a war. I have to arrest and deport all of you. Only then will I be able to quell the anger of the neighboring countries. Brendel tried his best to make his tone sound cold and businesslike, even though his heart felt like it was suffocating. Jill and Butt, who were being stared coldly by Brando, were so scared that their faces turned green. Although they did not know what this young noble meant, it sounded very scary. War, quelling anger, the two of them could not help but tremble in fear. Especially when Freya, who was wearing Erewhon's military uniform, was standing beside him. This made the threat even more convincing. Although Freya was wearing the uniform of the Imperial Guards, the two fairies could not tell the difference between the Imperial Guards and the soldiers of the Port Authority. In their eyes, Brendel was the terrifying god of death who wanted to capture them and bring them to justice. Of course, Freya knew that Magadol could not have been killed by the two of them. However, they might know something since they were here. She knew that Brando was using a trick to get information from them. Although she could not bear to see Jill and Butt trembling in fear, she could not help but harden her heart when she thought of Princess Magadol's tragic death. Butt and Jill were so scared that they could not speak until Brando added, "Of course, these punitive measures include confiscation of all your assets, including those that you buried in the forest outside the city." "No, how do you know?" Jill was scared silly. Every time the Port Authority confiscated all their loot, it was only a small part of it. This was because the fairies had a habit of burying their belongings. Their clan would usually choose an unknown and fixed place to bury their belongings. Usually, each clan would choose a place, and only the fairies themselves would know where the treasures of their clan were buried. However, Brando was an exception. No, I mean this has nothing to do with us, you can't do this. Jill and Butt panicked. If they were just scared silly before, this time they were really restless. Especially when they thought about the fact that their assets were still in jeopardy. Nothing to do with you? Brando raised his voice and asked coldly, then what are you doing here? Don't tell me you're here to steal? No, we're here to steal. But immediately confessed to his crime, and Jill was so anxious that he wanted to shut his mouth. Very well. Brando said coldly, according to the laws of Ampere Seal, stealing will also result in the confiscation of half of all your assets, and you will also have to spend a year in prison. You should know this, right? Oh no. But regretted it immediately. Although it was not all of their assets, half of it was enough for them to suffer. Especially since it was half of their real assets this time. But there's still a chance to make up for it. Brando changed the topic. Now that you're involved in a murder case, if you can provide some useful clues, maybe I'll consider reducing your sentence. When Brando said this, it was as if he was a judge, but the two great fairies did not think about the legal procedures to become a judge, or whether it was legal to hear their theft case here. In short, in their opinion, a noble definitely had the right to beat and kill them. The two of them hurriedly nodded their heads. Very well, tell me, how did you find her? Brando asked. Her? No, sir, we only found a pocket, we didn't know this. This princess was inside. Jill quickly replied. A pocket? Yes. Jill hurriedly revealed everything that he had seen earlier, afraid that he would miss something and cause this Lord Judge to change his original intention in anger. It was conceivable that since the other party could reduce their sentence, he could naturally increase it as well, right? For a moment, Jill was impressed by his own cleverness. His green eyes spun quickly, and for a moment, he even recalled some details that he didn't notice before. 3 people? Can you imitate their tone? Brando? Freya was slightly startled. She looked at Brando strangely, and felt that this request was a little excessive. To be honest, the tone and way of speaking between nobles were actually similar, and it was impossible to distinguish who was talking to each other from the other party, especially when one did not know who the other party was. But Brando shook his head slightly, indicating that there was no need for her to worry. He frowned slightly, and his thoughts were clearer than ever. Magadol's encounter had really angered him, and this time the people behind the scenes were destined to face his wrath. Ventriloquism was one of the basic skills of a burglar, and Jill was naturally proficient in it. He first imitated the tone of the first person, and Brando immediately understood. Moros. He muttered in his heart. Next. Yokum. Next. I don't seem to know this guy, but he sounds like a soldier. The Coast Guard should not be on the same side as the Holy Cathedral, and Moros and Yokum would not believe them, so he should be from one of the major legions. Count Videkin's confidant? Brando frowned. The question that Freya was worried about was actually not a problem for him. Ordinary people might not be able to tell, but that did not mean that he could not. Those who dared to attack Magadol were definitely not nobodies, but people with a strong background. There were only a few of these people in the whole of Erewhon, and they were all people that Brando was very familiar with. Their tone to him was very clear. Furthermore, the murder of Princess Magadol was something that even the Holy Cathedral would not be able to cover up. Therefore, the fewer people who knew, the better. The person who did it would definitely clean up the mess himself, and would not let others do it. And when he heard Jill's description, it confirmed his guess. It was indeed so. Brando's face revealed a cold smile, and his eyes were also filled with disdain. Freya looked at him and could not help but be slightly stunned. Brando, you know? She was a little surprised. Although Brando's ability had made her believe that there was nothing that he could not do, but this was a little too unbelievable. Was there really someone in this world who was born omniscient and omnipotent? This thought only existed in the future goddess of war's mind for a moment, but then she saw Princess Magadol's pale face, and her heart was filled with sorrow. She vaguely understood the reason for Brando's anger. Brando? She faintly called out sadly. But Brando patted her hand and whispered, Don't worry, Princess Magadol's matter can still be salvaged. But no matter what, this time I will definitely teach those people who are scheming in the dark an unforgettable lesson. The last few words were squeezed out through gritted teeth. Freya was stunned and could not help but look at her companion in disbelief. The princess she, Brando nodded seriously. This was not to comfort her, but because he suddenly remembered something. P.S. I went back to my hometown yesterday, and today I will make up a 5,000-word chapter. I will try my best to stabilize it. Although I have been off for a long time, I still hope that everyone will continue to support me. I will naturally repay everyone with better quality, thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 570. Outside the window, silver lightning occasionally flashed across the dark sea, like a dazzling flame that lit up the sky. Brando sat silently by the bed. Not far away, Princess Magadol was lying on the bed. She was so quiet that she looked like a sleeping beauty in a fairy tale. After a while, Orthlis's voice sounded in his mind. Brando, you guessed right. This little girl is not human. She's not even a living being. Brando's tone was calm. So you've already guessed it? Her hoarse voice was slightly surprised. In the scripture of creation, the epic of the Cruz people, the Pale poem, it says, mortal life was born from the water and multiplied on the earth. They were blessed by the wind and given wisdom by the fire. It also says that, at the beginning of creation, a noble kindness walked on the surface of the water and gave spirits to the small creatures that floated on the surface of the water. Thus life was formed. However, with light and darkness complementing each other, there was both positive and negative. Thus, the one above the gods decided that the end of life was the kingdom of the dead, where the dead would gather and be governed by a god, one. But beyond the boundary of life and death, there was a third camp, which was stone, metal and other things without souls. Note, the god of the dead, darkness under the light, the monarch of the realm of eternal death, Ko-si. I didn't know you were so knowledgeable about the Pale poem. I roughly understand that in this era, there are very few people who can read the ancient scriptures. And in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, these scriptures and prophecies are tantamount to lighthouses in the darkness. Although he could not see, Brando could still feel Orthlis turning her head to look out the window. He could not help but look in the same direction. Above the stormy sea, a lighthouse stood tall. In the darkness, a beam of light pierced into the deep sea. It was like a sharp sword, and also seemed to be the only truth in this world that was subverted. The magic storm at the edge of the world of order was gathering, more or less affecting the civilized world. This year's storm in the outer seas of Ampere Seal was more ferocious than usual, but there were very few people who noticed this abnormality. The sailboats kept their sails and entered the harbor, waiting for the storm to subside before going out to sea for the first time. I have a close relationship with the mages in the tower. Lady Orthlis, in a sense, I'm half a mage. I'm interested in history. Not only the Pale poem of the Cruz people, but I've even read some fragments of the Black Prophecy. Even though what you said makes sense, I still feel like you're hiding something from me, Orthlis said with a faint smile. Brendel could feel the mischievous look in her eyes. Also, I really hope you can call me sister instead of Lady Orthlis. I can't say that out loud. Brendel replied embarrassedly. Orthlis chuckled. Since you are my student, it shouldn't be a problem for you to call me teacher, right? Brando called out respectfully. Orthlis was not related to him, but she had given him a lot of help. She had even saved him more than once. This kind of care was like the care of a senior to a junior. Although Brando did not say it out loud, he was very grateful in his heart. Orthlis laughed. Good. So, what do you plan to do next? Orthlis was not the only one who asked this question. There were many people gathered in the room. Freya, who was standing beside the Roman, did not know that Brando was talking to a heroic spirit. But when she saw Brando's expression change, she quickly asked, How is it, Brando? It was only then that Brendel regained his senses. He looked at the others in the room. Sue, Amandina, the Shire, the Nightsong Tiger, Falerne, Tina, and the rest of the mercenaries of Lopez. Mephistopheles and Medisha were standing not far from the door. There was also the red-haired girl beside him who had not said a word. They were basically the core of his little group. Princess Magadol's wound went through her heart. I said that if it was a normal person it would be a fatal blow. Ah. Freya was stunned. She could not help but tremble as she pointed at Brando. Brando, you said. Brando could not help but laugh. I said that if it was a normal person, it would be a fatal blow. Oh, Brando, are you saying that this little girl is not a normal person? Out of everyone, the Roman reacted the fastest and immediately shouted. The others also reacted immediately and could not help but look at him suspiciously. Don't forget that you are also a little girl. Brando glared at Romaine, then nodded. I hope that you will not spread this news. Princess Magadol did not suffer a fatal blow because she is not a human. Not a human? Could it be that she is a half-elf like Princess Griffin? Freya asked in confusion. She could not help but look at the princess lying on the bed. Her ears were still the same as a normal person's. No, to be exact, she is not even considered a living being. Brando replied word by word. What? Everyone was startled. Brando was silent for a moment. In fact, it was hard for him to accept this fact at first. But when he checked the princess's injuries, he realized that something was wrong. First of all, when he opened the princess's status window, her name and other statuses were clear at a glance. Magadal's original name was Magadal Armand Loder de Antiburo. Armand Loder was her maternal family's surname, and Antiburo was her fief's name. The naming rules were completely in line with the local customs of Antiburo. At the same time, it was also in line with Brando's memory. For example, this name, as well as information like gender, were all known to Brando, which was why it was displayed in the status window. But there was one detail that caught his attention. Magadal's race was? This was very unusual. Logically speaking, Magadal was a human. Not to mention humans, it was very easy to tell the difference between common races. This was common knowledge, so in theory, it was impossible for him to not be able to tell. When he first saw Magadal's corpse, Brando's mind was in a mess, and he did not notice this detail. But when he looked back, he immediately felt that something was wrong. After carefully inspecting the princess's corpse, he immediately found another problem. The battlefield emergency told him that Princess Magadal had died at least 2 hours ago. However, after a few minutes of death, a person's muscles would begin to loosen, and their skin would change color and harden. This change would be quite obvious for the first hour, but there were no signs of it on the princess at that time. More importantly, although her skin was cold, it maintained a moderate amount of elasticity, as if she was in a healthy state. In Wand, most of the injuries and illnesses were cured by herbology and magic, so most people did not have the common knowledge of biology. But in Brando's eyes, these details were very unusual. So he quietly checked the princess's pupils and was shocked. In the state of death, Magadal's pupils were dim, as if the originally bright flame had been extinguished. It looked like the eyes of a dead person, but the pupils were not dilated, and most importantly, there was a trace of light in the depths of the eyes that seemed to have been extinguished. In Brando's memory, there was only one kind of existence that would show such signs after death. That was the radiance of the soul core, and there was only one type of life that needed to be driven by it, a puppet. At that time he almost screamed in fright. His first reaction was to wonder if this was a substitute of the princess, but then he realized that it was impossible, because he immediately found the silver ornament of the wind elves on the dead princess' body. This ornament was the one he had given to her at the auction in the afternoon. If this puppet was Princess Magadal's substitute, then there was no need for her to keep it, lest the matter of her meeting with Brando be exposed. Moreover, this Princess Antiburo might not be too exquisite as a puppet. Other than her pupils, there were no signs of life on her body. She was made of flesh and blood just like a normal person. Whether it was her intelligence, personality, or emotions, she was completely the same as a normal person. Brando found it hard to believe that the girl who had discussed with him how to help his best friend, who had a firm belief and a pure heart, was a puppet. But after Orthlis examined her carefully, she finally concluded that the princess was indeed a very special existence that was very different from normal life. To be more precise, it was a very special puppet. At least in Brando's experience, he had never seen such a strange life form. This princess was obviously not a soulless, rigid construct. Brando was more willing to admit that she was a very special race, and in fact Orthlis agreed with this point. In the memories of the Wind Elf, she had seen such an existence before. They were once puppets, but were later given intelligence and formed their own race. This race was the Rune Dwarfs. Since there were similar existences, then perhaps Magadal's existence was not that strange. But what Brando was curious about was her identity. Magadal was a princess of a duchy, and was not like him who existed out of thin air. He just did not know if her parents, the Duke and his wife, knew about this fact. If not, then it would be interesting. At least for now, it seemed that Magadal did not know about it, and she had always thought of herself as a human. Even in history, Brando had not heard of this at all. But he remembered something. It was rumored that the nun princess's life after marriage was very miserable, and she even disappeared in the end. Originally, it was just a rumor in the history of the nobles, but now it seemed to be a little strange. Brando shook his head and threw these messy thoughts out of his mind. He carefully explained his thoughts to the people around him. Of course, except for the last part, everyone could not help but widen their eyes. Wait, Brando, are you saying that Princess Magadal is a puppet? Not only Freya but even Amandina was a little stunned. But... No, in fact Her Highness is not a puppet, it's just a metaphor. Brando shook his head and explained, "Simply put, Princess Magadol's vital signs are different from what we know. She does not have blood circulation and is not a carbon-based life form, but a construct life form. But like us, she has her own soul." What is blood circulation and carbon-based life form? Is that a mage's vocabulary? Amandina asked, puzzled. Ahem, Brando immediately realized that he had misspoken, but with the difference in knowledge between him and these people, it was really difficult to explain. He could only cover it up and said, "That's a professional term, just listen to it. In short, it's like the rune dwarves, right?" Brando said it before, but was Uncle Odom really a puppet in the past? Roman could not help but ask curiously. This young lady's train of thought was always different from others. "No," Brando replied unhappily, "that was tens of thousands of years ago. If he was a puppet, it would be Odom's ancestor who was a puppet. It has nothing to do with him." But Her Highness does not know anything about this. Could it be that Princess Magadol has been lying to Princess Griffin? Although she had only interacted with the future Princess Regent for a short period of time, Freya was already thinking about her. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately gave her a look and shook his head. "No, I suspect that Princess Magadol herself does not know anything." "She does not know anything?" Freya was slightly stunned and wanted to ask more, but seeing Brando's look, she immediately shut her mouth. She immediately reacted. If Princess Magadol herself did not know anything, then there was a big problem. She thought for a moment and changed her words. "Then how can we save her? To be exact, Princess Magadol is not dead at all. As for how to wake her up, I need to look up some information. But right now we have more important things to do." Brando looked out of the window. There was almost no light between the sea and the sky, but the hourglass had reached the end of its journey, and the most important day in the history of Ampere Seal was about to arrive. But when it came to it, he was a little hesitant. What made Marquis Joachim and the others kill a princess and a high-ranking priest of the Holy Cathedral? This was too important. What did Princess Magadol see in the end? The originally clear history seemed to be darkening, as if a huge vortex was forming in front of him. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 571. The star of the other side had already risen in the night sky. The howling winds and layers of dark clouds could not cover its brilliance. That was Martha's main star, the symbol of order and wisdom. It was already early in the morning, and there was a glimmer of light under the dark sea. Brando silently raised his head and looked at the horizon, silently calculating the time. There were 3 hours before the next sunrise. 3 o'clock in the morning. Under the coastal waters of Ampere Seal, a few imperceptible figures appeared. Their vertical fins were like blades that split the surface of the water, drawing white traces on the surface of the sea. Sani quietly came to Brando's side. This male Naga watched the Naga army pass through the bay in the storm. He could not help but raise his green-gray fins and stand proudly against the wind and rain. "This is a warrior of my race." He turned his head and looked at Brando with his prismatic eyes. Brando was silent, but there was only a fire burning in his heart. Finally this day had arrived. After half a year of painstaking planning, after going through untold hardships, history had finally returned to its original point at this moment. What the future held was still unknown, but he had already thrown away everything in his heart. If he won, then this future that was on the verge of destruction would finally be dragged away from its original track of history. Her Royal Highness, the Valkyrie, and even the little Roman, anyone and their beliefs that were attached to this ship could continue to exist. If he lost, Brando pursed his lips and looked forward. His eyes were filled with darkness. In the darkness, the lightning that tore the sky and the sea apart was like the blazing flames that burned above Erewhon in the past. His eyes were also burning with raging flames. Brando looked back at Sani, and this male Naga could not help but lean back. Its heart was slightly suffocated. This kind of determination and will, it had only seen in the eyes of Her Royal Highness, and a person with such determination would eventually set off a storm on the sea. The half-elf girl also retracted her gaze from the dark sky. The layers of dark clouds did not seem to be able to block her gaze. Behind her, the stars on the other side were slowly rising. Martha was announcing the arrival of dawn to the world. The sky was about to brighten. She turned around and saw Makarov, Fleetwood, Count Bar, Oberway and the other ministers. It was as if the royal faction had never been divided. Nothing had changed. She felt a little absent-minded, as if history had not changed and the wheels were rolling forward. She could finally unify the whole of Erewhon with the help of these people, but there was still darkness ahead. "Your Highness, please get in the carriage." Griffin turned around and looked at her mentor for the last time. Fleetwood's eyes were filled with shame. She turned around in disappointment. It would be great if they could be so stubborn. The carriage stopped in the rain, pitch black like a coffin. The princess opened the door, raised her head, and walked into the carriage like a real member of the Erewhon royal family. Cunning fox, Makarov leaped onto his horse. Even though he was a noble, he had spent his entire life in the military. His back was as straight as a javelin. Everyone's attention was focused on him as he pulled out his sword and pointed forward. "Let's go." The sound of hooves could be heard as the Royal Knight Regiment began to gather beside the carriage. Everyone was wearing a cloak as they moved forward silently in the rain. The black troop meandered through the forest. Freya tilted her head to listen to the uniform galloping of the horses. She was tired after a sleepless night. She turned her head back, and the silent Knight of the Lake was just a shoulder behind her. "Mr. Knight. Today I might have to use it to kill someone. The other party is also a member of Erewhon, and even a comrade from yesterday. I might have brought shame to the Lionheart sword. I'm sorry." "The sword will never be shamed by killing," he replied coldly. It was the first time he had spoken in a few days. Freya turned around in surprise. "Swords shall walk through thorns, the teachings of the sages." The Knight of the Lake replied proudly. After that, there was silence. In front of everyone was the stormy port of Ampere Seal. "Her Highness has set off." Carglass read the note in his hand and immediately turned to look at his lord. Although his voice was deliberately calm, it was difficult to suppress the fire in his eyes. "My lord." "I know." Brando nodded. Everyone's eyes fell on him. It was already dawn, and the dark sea in the distance seemed to be undergoing a great change. A white line had already broken out of its cocoon. "The White Lion Legion," Brendel said, taking a deep breath. "Yes." The young people roared. After experiencing the hardships of the Black Forest, the storm before them was insignificant. Instead, the strength of the enemy in front of them aroused the unyielding spirit in their hearts. Young people could not compromise, and no one cared whether this battle was right or wrong. The only thing that mattered was this battle. This day would be written into the pages of history. The royal faction has set off. Almost at the same time that Brando received the news, the same news was sent to the Holy Cathedral. Watching the messenger soldier leave, Archbishop Moros looked back with a gloomy face. Marquis Yoakum and Baron Buckland, who were hidden in the shadows, quickly bowed their heads respectfully. "History is rewritten," Moros replied quietly. "Order the White Lion Legion to enter the city." At the same time, countless messages were sent through various channels to every corner of Ampere Seal. The port, which had been silent for too long in the storm, was now like a giant beast that had awakened and begun to stretch its claws and fangs. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the gate of the Coast Guard cavalry camp opened, and the patrolling cavalry poured out. At 5:20 o'clock, the city was under martial law. Half an hour later, the port of Ampere Seal officially announced the start of storm season. The port was sealed. "Ready, get ready." Sets of standard armor were unloaded from the ship. The oilskin bags were opened and dismantled. Then dozens of young officers of the White Lion Legion began to put on the armor. They had tried it on once or twice, but most of the time they could only wear the training armor. But just trying it on once or twice was enough for everyone to understand the power of this armor. This set of armor was the real White Lion battle armor, and it was restored after consulting Brendel and Orthlis's opinions. It was even stronger than the original. These young people from Tanajul might not understand what this meant, but just a set of magic armor was enough to make everyone gasp. Even Grodin would not be willing to equip his personal knight with a set of magic armor. The price of a few sets of magic armor was enough to buy a rich piece of land. The new White Lion armor looked a bit like the Maximilian armor from another world, the pinnacle of armor from the medieval era. However, there was no leg armor, and the armor skirt was distributed in sheets. The helmet was still the traditional full-face helmet of the Wind Elves. The most distinctive feature was the White Lion armor on the right shoulder. This design had long been removed from Erewhon's White Lion armor, but in Brando's hands, it returned to the land of Wond. The inspiration for this armor came from Brando. Only the unique soul in his body could create an aesthetic that transcended the world and even the era. It was an aesthetic that came from another world. But it had to be said that art was universal. The new White Lion armor had a kind of beauty that moved people's hearts. When it was put together, it was full of tension that took one's breath away. Such a straightforward expression was very rare in this era of Erewhon. Craftsmen were also artists. Brando's designs even made master craftsmen and Orthless shine with splendor. In the end, they could only attribute this seemingly innate talent to the word freak. Soon the White Lion Legion was ready. All the young officers gathered and stood neatly in front of Brando, waiting for the inspection. At this moment, not only did Brando hold his breath, even the Shire could not help but be stunned. The priestess from Tanajul, Maria and Amandina looked at each other. Heavens, isn't this the legendary White Lion Legion? It's exactly the same as the records. The Shire shook his head in amazement. He was also present when the armor was designed, but he did not expect to see such an effect after wearing it. Even though I've never seen the White Lion Legion before, I really wish I was born in King Eric's era. The Nightsong Tiger could not help but nod in admiration. The White Lion Legion had been reborn. Only Brando and Orthless knew that this was the real White Lion Legion. The elites that Erwin had eliminated from history had now returned, as if they were carrying the will of the late king to save this fallen kingdom. With the sword in hand, was it time for the oath to be reborn? My lord, please inspect the armor. Cargly's eyes shone brightly as he spoke. Brando smiled slightly. In this world, the White Lion armor was a proper light infantry armor. To be more precise, it was a cavalry armor. Due to the different weight, cavalry armor usually had much higher defense than infantry armor. But only the White Lion armor broke through this limit. Its biggest feature was that it inherited the magical properties of the half-plate wind armor. The core of the armor was the reduction in weight. But not only that, even though the wind was gentle, it also had a violent side. The power of the wind on the White Lion armor complemented each other. It was one of the most perfect armors in history. Otherwise, the White Lion infantry would not have been known as the cavalry of the earth. The king led the knight to unify the south. There was only one knight with a sword. It was almost time. Brando turned around. A carriage came through the thin curtain of rain. The family emblem of a broken sword on the wall of the carriage seemed to have traveled through history. The carriage stopped not far away and the door opened. Inside the carriage was the calm face of the countess who came out of Yenbao. Mr. Brando, the family of the Sword Protector, is a man of his word. His descendants have never forgotten the oath before the sword. Now, I hope to invite you to travel with me for the last time. Will you do me the honor? Her quiet voice penetrated the sound of the wind and rain. It would be my pleasure. Brendel replied with a smile. He turned around. Carglass, I'll leave this to you. White Lion Legion, follow the original plan and cooperate with Sani. Don't let me down, Carglass nodded solemnly. Brando turned around again. Teacher, I'll have to trouble you. The Ash Sword Saint nodded and took the reins of a war horse from a young man who came out from behind the house. His gray eyes glanced at Brando before he mounted the horse. The Shire, Scarlet and Mephistopheles also mounted behind him. Hendrik. What is it? I know you won't ride in the rain. Come with me. Brando waved his hand and turned around to walk towards the carriage. The vampire princess snorted softly. But at this moment, a small voice called out to them from behind. Brando. Brando turned around and saw Romaine in the crowd. Don't forget the promise. Romaine shouted with all her might, but I'll support you. You know that. Brando suddenly felt like he had returned to that night in Bucci in the summer. That night, the stars were still as bright as ever. The river of stars in the sky was like a link that connected the fates of him, Roman, and Freya. It's a promise, Brando smiled at her. We'll become great merchants. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for it at Chidian. Come. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 572. Thousands of soldiers marched forward in silence in the rain. They moved in unison without a single noise. Everywhere they looked, everything was gray. Their armor, helmet tassels, and cloaks complemented each other. Who are they? The veterans on the tower looked down at the fortress in awe. They looked at each other in dismay. This army was obviously a strong one, and the most difficult opponent to deal with on the battlefield. But Aween still had such a strong army. Did they come from Fort Korkaz? Or did they come from the snowy battlefield on the northern plateau? Until a flag pierced through the darkness. On the flag, the emblem of a single-horned white lion had been there for hundreds of years. It carried the most glorious history of this ancient kingdom, shining brightly. I'm afraid they are not ordinary people, the captain beside him muttered to himself. He turned around and said, It's the White Lion Legion. The White Lion Legion has arrived. Open the gate. Open the gate. Open the gate. The sentinel's command was transmitted from the towering city wall, intermittently passing through the curtain of rain. The huge wooden door pushed open the muddy water and slowly opened with the low and heavy creaking of the capstan. The marching troops stopped. Owen looked up and stared at the gray walls of the ancient fortress. This was the center of the southern part of the kingdom that they had been guarding. This city was built by the late King Eric. Its glory was written on its walls. From now on, Erwin was no longer under the control of the Cruz people. This wall had been weathered and baptized by the flames of war, but it had never fallen into the hands of the enemy. This time it was going to cleanse itself. White Lion Legion entered the city. Before daybreak, Madeline dragged the newcomer to the quay. It was dark outside the port, but the waves were so huge that the sea seemed to be overturned. The storm swept across the entire outer sea. Beyond the chain, the sea was boiling, and a line of white broken waves was clearly visible under the headland lighthouse. He had never seen such violent weather in the past 10 years. Damn it, the waves are so big. Madeline praised in the wind and rain. He had been a port guard for 12 years and could be considered experienced and knowledgeable, but he had never seen such a spectacular scene. I have never seen such a storm since I was young. The old witch in Sea Breeze Cape said that the dark dragon has been resurrected. What we see now is an omen. The new recruit said with a pale face as he watched a small sailboat being dragged into the open sea from the anchorage. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the huge whirlpool. He couldn't help but tremble as he spoke. Cut the crap. I can't drown you. Madeline kicked him. Let's get to work. Stop procrastinating. He looked up and could not help but shake his head. But this year is indeed unusual. What now? Captain, there seems to be something in the sea. Are you seeing things? They're probably sailors who fell overboard. May Martha bless them and pray for their own good fortune. Madeline shook his head. Falling into the water at this time of the year, it would be a miracle to survive. Madeline did not know where this unlucky person came from. Perhaps it was someone from the previous boat. No, it's a shark. There are a lot of sharks in the sea. The new recruit suddenly screamed as if he had seen a ghost. Sharks? Madeline was stunned and could not help but turn his head. On the surface of the sea, there was a white wave with an erect fin that looked like a flag. Then a second wave, a third wave, dozens of white waves passed through the huge waves, forming a huge assault arrowhead that pointed straight at the dock. Then a second and a third arrowhead appeared. Almost in the blink of an eye, the entire port of Ampere Seal was facing the attack at the same time. On the surface of the sea, hundreds of thousands of waves were accelerating, like a huge pack of wolves rushing over. Madeline's face suddenly changed. That's not a shark. It's an enemy attack. He only felt his legs go weak. He staggered and turned around, wanting to rush to the alarm bell on the dock. But just as he turned around, he hit a solid wall with a bang. The old port guard only felt his vision go black. He could not help but look up in fear. What he saw was a humanoid, snake-shaped monster with a cold, angular face that resembled a lizard's. Naga? Madeline's eyes were filled with disbelief as he slowly fell to the ground. Sani retracted his hand and looked coldly at the two guards who had fainted on the ground. He had seen the weakness of humans before. But such a weak race also had impressive strong people. He turned around and looked at the sea. It was like a magnificent picture with a violent storm as the background, and under this picture, countless Nagas were landing. In the blink of an eye, the dock and the trestle bridge had been declared the change of hands. Ampere Seal's 7 docks, 1 backup dock and 2 military docks, were attacked at the same time. The port guards were unable to resist and were defeated in an instant. Dock number 3 has fallen. Dock number 4 has fallen. Sir, they are setting fire to the ships. How is this possible? Kinoan was almost screaming at his subordinates. In fact, he did not need to report to know the situation at the port. Outside the window there was a storm, but in the direction of the dock, there was a blazing fire. Are you all useless? Come on, tell me who is attacking us. Sir, it's the Nagas. Greyfin Nagas. Nagas? The deputy director of the port almost threw the ink bottle on the desk. You can't even defeat a group of bandits? No, sir. But there are too many of them. The adjutant quickly explained. Too many? 100? 1,000? Kinoan was furious. Although the Greyfin Nagas often attacked merchant ships on the sea route, they almost never attacked the port. His first reaction was that his subordinates were trying to shirk the responsibility. This was the most common thing they did. No, sir, 1,000. Tens of thousands. The adjutant could not believe it, but he forced himself to answer. But this time, Kinoan didn't get angry because everyone heard a cry of surprise. Oh my God! Everyone turned their heads. Amidst the raging sea waves, a huge shadow suddenly appeared. The monster was so huge that it was like a floating mountain that suddenly appeared in everyone's field of vision. Demon whale. Kinoan slumped in his seat. His mind was in a mess, but there was only one thought in his mind. He could not be the director of the port anymore. I don't want it anymore. What the hell is going on? The port is under attack. Requesting backup? The commander of the patrolling cavalry regiment, Sir Zenopa Lee, took the order and looked at the messenger suspiciously. He pondered for a moment and raised his head. The sky in the direction of the port was half red. Even an idiot would know what was going on. Sir? He shook his head. His gaze became deep, as if his mind was trying to penetrate the heavy rain. The surrounding cavalry turned around and waited for their commander's orders. We have a more important mission, Sir Zenopa replied. But what about the port? Let Kinoan take care of it himself. Are the people of Ampere Seal feeding them a bunch of good-for-nothings? If he can't handle it, let him complain to the parliament himself. Zenopa snorted and added, the Grey Fin Nagas are taking advantage of the situation. They will get what they deserve in the future. However, before he could finish his sentence, another messenger stumbled into everyone's field of vision from afar. Before he arrived, his voice was heard. Sir, it's not good. The Nagas have begun to attack the city. What? Zenopa's face changed. That's impossible. Are those bandits crazy? This is no longer a robbery. Martha Buff. They are declaring war. The Grey Fin Nagas were declaring war. They were participating in this civil war. Onward, onward. The storm is protecting the people of Manas. Let them be fearless. On the dock of the First Army of Ampere Seal, Sani watched all of this coldly. He raised a blue trident and pointed it forward. Behind him, thunder and lightning flashed. In front of him, a torrent of water surged. Her Majesty the Queen has ordered the Grey Fin Nagas to attack the inner city of Ampere Seal. Meet up with our allies on land. May the sacred covenant be unbreakable. Let us fight together again. Attack. The emblem of the heavenly snake Manas could be clearly seen on the tip of the trident. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize it as the most precious treasure of the Grey Fin Nagas, the scepter of the sea god. Sir Zenopa Lee's face was as cold as iron. He turned around and raised his sword. Patrol cavalry, listen to my orders. Your enemies today are those who are plotting to divide the kingdom. Follow me and attack the Grey Fin Nagas. Erwin. Long live. Long live. The storm raged. The sword was pointed forward. In the sound of the wind and rain, people and horses neighed. On the square, large groups of cavalry were quickly turning around. In the blink of an eye, the patrol cavalry had split up. The patrol cavalry is moving. He really did have plans. Count Audine put down his brass binoculars. He stood together with a stranger in a straw raincoat. The fat noble was still following behind him. They had all gone through the test of life and death in the Black Forest. At this moment, the relationship between them was much stronger than before. Behind them, there were hundreds of silent noble private soldiers. In the pouring rain, everyone was solemn. The Count turned around. Master Ludio. The mysterious man in the straw raincoat nodded. I have received news from the Loop of Sky. I don't know what happened to the Loop of Trade Winds, but I hope they are doing the right thing. Whether it is right or wrong, we have to try it for ourselves. Audine's gaze pierced through the rain. Between the sea and the sky, the silver raindrops formed a straight line. Besides, I have confidence in that person. It has nothing to do with confidence. To me, this is an order. The man in the straw raincoat shook his head. He raised his hand. There was a ring on his hand. The ring was as green as a dream, and the emerald on it had formed a tree shape. Crash. A series of soft sounds could be heard. Everyone could not help but turn around. A few miles away from Ampere Seal was the Frata Forest. The forest canopy stretched for thousands of miles. They could only see a black mass of birds of prey soaring into the sky. In a moment they covered the sky. In the blink of an eye, they were like a black cloud pressing down on the port of Ampere Seal. The guards at the south gate of the port of Ampere Seal felt that today was the end of the world. Everyone could not help but turn pale and stare blankly at the scene. Countless, uncountable birds were flying straight towards the city. Martha above, what the hell is going on? And from a bird's eye view, the ancient port seemed to be caught in a terrible torrent. The torrent was raging. Above the clouds, a huge black shadow disappeared in a flash. A pair of golden eyes blinked and could not help but exclaim in admiration. How interesting, little guy. P.S. Come, let us burn to ashes together. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 573. Even in the most chaotic world there was a quiet corner. The light in the small room flickered. The merchant girl was lying on the edge of the wooden bed, resting her chin on her crossed hands. Her eyes darted around curiously, guarding the nun princess who seemed to be in a deep sleep. Occasionally she would poke the nun princess with her finger. Amandina, why do you think Miss Magadol is a puppet? Look at her soft skin, it's so fun. She's so pretty too. Brando must be lying, right? Amandina sighed. Those familiar with the little Roman's personality would know that she meant fun, and not the second half of the sentence. Amandina was holding a book of Rockefeller's selected poems, but her mind was not on it at all. She had already flown into the rain. On the battlefield. Swords flashed, the two sides slaughtered each other. This day would be written in the history of the port. But the next day the sun would shine on that side of the land. Could they really win? Amandina's heart was hanging in mid-air. She put down the book, silently took off her silver-rimmed glasses and looked out. The direction of the port was a sea of red. There seemed to be sobbing in the wind and rain, as if Erwin's spirit was crying in the air. But the intermittent wailing before death, she did not know if it belonged to her family or friends. Be careful, don't be too rude to Princess Magadol. You're already being too rude. Amandina looked at the little Roman sneakily pressing on the nun princess's almost perfect chest, and could not help but scold her in exasperation. I know. She replied matter-of-factly. Amandina glared at her. Amandina restrained herself. Yes, are you going out? Yes, it's too stuffy in the room, it's making me restless. Amandina looked at the nun princess on the bed with some jealousy. Also, if Princess Magadol suddenly wakes up, don't tell her anything. But Brando said she won't wake up for a while. I mean if. The Roman watched Amandina leave the room. She turned back, but for a moment she seemed to see the girl's eyelids move slightly. About a few seconds later, it moved slightly again. This time she saw it clearly. The merchant girl immediately turned around and shouted, but stopped herself. This was all thanks to the Roman. It was better to wait for a while. As she thought this, she turned her head back. She carefully looked at the nun princess on the bed. The nun princess Magadol seemed to have fallen into some kind of nightmare. Her brows were slightly furrowed, and she seemed to be very tired. She struggled slightly and some soft sounds came from her mouth. Roman was immediately curious. She leaned forward and carefully put her ear next to his mouth. Finally she heard a few words clearly. How could this be? Be careful. Be careful? Romain stood up and thought, seriously, for a moment before placing a finger on Magadol's forehead. Miss Magadol, are you dreaming? Let the little Roman help you calm your nightmares. A faint light flashed in the room. The heavy rain created a hazy world in the plaza outside the Anderla Cathedral. The black carriages passed through the curtain of rain, silently stopping in front of the main entrance of the cathedral. The emblems on the carriages shone for a moment. Vitokin of the Pale Lone Wolf, Arek of the Mountains and Eagle, Kirkoberg of the Crescent Lily, Cipher of the Flowing Wind and Flaming Moon, Grimoires of the Long Sword and Black Pine, and Karsuk of the Black Tower. The broken sword of Yenbao also dimmed slightly. When Arek got off the carriage, his expression was indifferent. Devard the Eagle and Sylvia the Silver Knight stood beside him. He raised his head, and Duke Cipher, who was not far away, responded with a slight smile. However, the red-haired man in the Cipher royal family's entourage was like a crane in a flock of chickens. Flaming Nicholas, the sword master of the Cipher royal family, elemental realm. His strength is above Devard and the Silver Knight. Brando's gaze shifted to another person. The old man in the purple robe, the mentor of the eldest son of the king, the eccentric Garlock. Archmage Cruz, his strength is on par with Fleetwood. The old man beside Count Vitokin, the veteran general of the Black Blade Squad, is Nigel, known as the Unshakable Sword. Although he is not a sword master, his strength is close to elemental activation. Most people think that he is in the elemental activation realm. Vitokin was his attendant when he was young. In addition, Vitokin himself has the strength of an upper gold rank. Brando looked around and found that the head of the White Lion Legion, Marquis Balta, and Admiral Count Janalesu were not there. He could not help but frown slightly. But even so, the scene was full of elites. Including the head of the Highland Knight Regiment, Erwin's elemental realm powerhouses were almost all gathered here. Those below gold rank were as numerous as the hairs on a cow. The power of a country was undoubtedly displayed here. And what kind of scene the crew's empire was like, except for Brando, perhaps no one present could imagine. You know them all? Dilfrey could not help but ask curiously. Just once, Brando replied. As he answered, everyone entered the holy temple. It was still the Roxby Palace. This was a place that was destined to leave a deep mark in history. Before Brando and Dilfrey entered this magnificent palace built in the 277th year of the First Era, he could not help but raise his head slightly and look up. On the arched beam, the murals of the final battle where the Flame King expelled the Myrna people were vividly colored. The famous holy sword was dazzling. It was just that the sages of the past were determined to sweep away all darkness, but would their descendants have such courage? I'm afraid not. The main hall was silent. Out of the ordinary, Bishop Moros was the first to enter the holy temple. He looked around and did not say a word. Two high-ranking priests followed him to the center of the hall. Everyone was stunned. Something big happened. Brando raised his head and narrowed his eyes, but he saw Erex's expressionless face and Duke Cypher's fearless smile as he stared at his niece opposite him. Princess Griffine's face was calm, but the people of the royal faction beside her looked solemn. It was obvious that there was a rift between the two sides. Moros paused for a moment, and there was no trace of joy or anger on his gloomy face. He slowly raised his head. Martha above must be gratified by her people's yearning and pursuit of peace, because whether it is the people of Cruz or the people of Erewhon, at least it proves that the descendants of the Flame King still adhere to justice. However, he changed the topic and his expression turned cold. Ampere Seal is now shrouded in darkness. The Holy Temple is incompetent, and the people of the Holy Temple are rampant in this place. Before coming here, I received news that some of you are colluding with the Sheephead cult. But I don't want to believe that the glorious nobles of Erewhon have fallen to this extent. I hope that before the meeting begins, someone can stand up and prove their innocence. Archbishop Moros's words caused an uproar in the hall. For a moment, the hall could not help but resound with the buzzing of discussions. Everyone looked around curiously, as if they were trying to find the hidden traitor among the nobles. Only Brendel looked coldly at Duke Cypher, Joachim, and Vito Kin in the north with a smug look on their faces. Only Erek looked indifferent as if it had nothing to do with him and he didn't care at all. The north was already a monolithic block. Brando turned his head and found that the Green Knight in the south was still not moving, as if they were waiting to see what would happen. Only Makarov had a look of disdain, while Fleetwood's face was as cold as water. Despicable. Brando heard Countess Griffin scold softly. Mr. Makarov, you know who I'm talking about. Moros's gaze suddenly turned to the people of the royal faction. Someone in the crowd exclaimed as if they had just expected something. Nonsense. Makarov's face was cold. He secretly frowned. The Holy Temple had acted earlier than expected, and this made him feel a little passive. However, the other party was pressing on step by step. Could it be that they were ready for war? The Black Blade Squad had not advanced to the front line of the Grey Mountain, and only a vanguard had reached Ampere Seal. What made the other party so fearless? I also know that this is nonsense, but since it is nonsense, I hope Mr. Makarov can expose this lie and give us the truth. We must know that the nobles of Erewhon cannot be slandered. Moros replied calmly. All right, even if it's not necessary, it's just a small matter, Makarov replied coldly, but before I prove myself, do you have any proof for your words? Of course. To be exact, what I have is not evidence, but a witness. Moros added. There was an uproar. Brando also raised his eyebrows slightly. There was a traitor in the royal faction. He immediately thought. As expected, Makarov and the others immediately turned around in shock and anger. The royal faction and the old nobles had been fighting for many years, but there had never been a traitor. It was not only Makarov. Everyone present was shocked. Almost everyone in the royal faction was a hero of their time, and there was even a rumor that there were only those who died in battle, and no one who surrendered. Who would betray the royal faction? Everyone could not help but look at the royal faction in the south. But just as they looked over, someone walked out from behind Moros. It was him. Brando was shocked but also shocked. Viscount Benninger. The half-elf princess suddenly stood up and looked at the young man in front of her as if she had never met him before. Her expression was calm, but her clenched and trembling fists said everything. Where? My brother. Her Royal Highness took a deep breath and gritted her teeth as she asked. But Benninger only glanced at her and did not care about the gloomy Makarov at the side. He raised his head and looked at everyone. Everyone knows that I once admired the princess and even betrayed my family. But even so, I cannot allow the royal faction to be in cahoots with the cultists, and I do not want to see the princess fall into it." Every word was said, and the hall was silent for a moment. Everyone present had already guessed what was going on, but they could not help but feel lucky that they did not provoke House Cypher. It was too vicious. Brendel pursed his lips. There was no mention of this Viscount betraying the royal faction in the slightest. Instead, he was praised for his loyal pursuit of love. This person was really good at hiding his emotions. His heart was filled with shock, but there was also an inexplicable sense of relief. At least the royal faction was stabbed in the back. It was better than being stabbed in the back, wasn't it? But this was a big problem. If he remembered correctly, the little prince was taken away by the royal faction. This was going to be troublesome. And there was even more trouble to come. He suddenly saw Benninger turning towards him. What was this guy doing? "Count Benninger, this Mr. Brando beside you, I'm afraid he's not your aide?" While Brendel's thoughts were running through his mind, Benninger spoke to Dilfrey coldly. "What are you waiting for?" Dilfrey was stunned. She never thought that the battlefield would come to her so quickly. According to Brando, they were supposed to help the princess leave Ampere Seal. This was also the mission of the Swordkeeper family. Instead of facing these messy questions head-on, Benninger did not expect her to answer. It was enough to make her look surprised. He continued to ask aggressively, "Mr. Brando, the earliest news I have is that you came from Bucci, and claimed to be a Highland knight. Then you rebelled in Tonagel, killed the local lord and gathered people to rebel. And the other truth is that your real identity is a sheephead disciple, and you are involved with All for One. And now you are conspiring with the royal faction to seize the power of this kingdom. Am I wrong?" The Viscount raised his chin slightly. "Whether it's true or not, you don't have to answer. We just need to ask the noble knights from Karsuk, whether you are the descendant of the so-called Highland Knight, where did your noble identity come from, and the truth will be revealed." Brendel furrowed his brows. The other party came prepared. Although he wasn't afraid of being exposed, his identity as a rebel was going to be confirmed after today. But he could not help but turn around and look at the real knights from the mountains and highlands. After being a pirate for more than a year, it was inevitable that he would feel anxious when he saw the real deal. Benninger smiled confidently and turned to the leader of the Highland Knights. "Dear leader, rumor has it that you always keep your promises and abide by the creed of the knight. We believe that you will never lie, so why don't you tell us the truth?" Benninger was good with words, and the leader of the Highland Knights smiled. He was indeed an old-fashioned knight. The Highland Knights were passed down from his family, and the knight spirit was almost ingrained in his bones. The leader raised his head. From afar, he looked like an ordinary middle-aged man, but Brando happened to know this man named Bun-Eyed Norbert. When the man's eyes fell on him, he could not help but feel guilty. The title of Steel Knight was not given out of nowhere. This seemingly easygoing uncle had a great reputation in Karsuk. The number of Madara's generals that died in his hands was in the double digits, both in history and now. It was also because of him that Madara did not have much of an advantage in Karsuk during the First War of the Black Rose. The middle-aged man smiled back at Brendel, but his gaze shifted to the area behind Brendel. "The Shire, is it you?" he asked seriously. Wow, there was an uproar in the hall. P.S. Where is the truth? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 574. 6 o'clock in the morning. The Black Blade Squad's vanguard camp. The shrill magic alarm swept through the entire camp in an instant, like a landslide or a tsunami. The black-armored knight was fully armed. He rushed out of the resting area with clanking accessories hanging from his body and went straight to his mount. Many flying dragons were spreading their wings. Viscount Kustar Bolman put down his binoculars. The sky in the south was dark. Countless raptors shuttled back and forth between the thunder and lightning. It was like the end of the world. It's the Druids. The Southerners are at their wits' end. He was silent. He flipped onto the saddle, held the nearly 5-meter-long dragon spear in one hand, and raised his left hand high. The sound of a tsunami seemed to erupt from the camp in an instant. Black Blade Squad, 1st Dragon Cavalry Brigade, let's go! Let's go! One by one, the giant beasts rose into the air. Their outstretched wings covered the sky. The logisticians on the ground watched their knight rise into the air. It seemed that in the blink of an eye, a huge battle formation had been formed in the sky. Dalit, don't drop the ball at the crucial moment. The ground crew shouted to the sky. Screw you. The knight in the sky scolded. The young man looked up. In front of him, under the rain clouds, thunder and lightning were surging. Tens of thousands of raptors rushed toward him. It's the Arrow Eagles. Watch out. They're accelerating. The voice above shouted. Everyone joined the battle formation. A serious voice came from the magic crystal. Roger, back to the team. The first attack group is expected to arrive in 30 seconds. 20 seconds. Dalit looked up. His eyes were full of fanaticism. The Black Blade Squad had been on standby for a long time. At this moment, everyone could only feel the blood in their body boiling. Viscount Kustar Bolman held the dragon spear in his hand. His heart was as firm as steel. He was only silently estimating the time. 10 seconds. 8 seconds. 2 seconds. Engage, for Erwin. The sky of Ampere Seal seemed to be ignited by the huge sound of battle in an instant. It was boiling. The huge black dragon and the countless birds of prey crossed each other. In an instant, there was a foul wind and a rain of blood. The opened wings were like blades cutting into the storm of feathers, and the corpses of the birds fell like raindrops. However, the Wyvern Knight was also swept away by the great resistance, and the first arrow's attack formation was instantly obliterated. Warning roars, fighting, and screams could be heard from all directions. The knights at the front were pulled down from their saddles by the huge impact, and the wyverns could not bear the burden either. They wailed and fell down one by one. They were like black meteors. The flames of war spread and burned. The buzz of discussion in the hall seemed to have died down in an instant. There was only dead silence under the solemn vault of Roxby Palace. Time seemed to have frozen at this moment. "The Shire, is that you?" The captain of the Highland Knight Regiment, Bun-Eyed Norbert, stood tall. He had a confident look on his face. His voice was not loud, but it echoed in the hall. There was an uproar. Everyone looked at each other. "Captain Bun-Eyed, you said that name?" An envoy asked in disbelief. That person stood up from Grenoir's seat. "Captain Bun-Eyed, are you sure you're not mistaken?" Another counselor joined in loudly. This person was a trusted aide of Duke Vero. Brando had met him once in the game. The others were also discussing, and most of their eyes were focused on the Shire. "Ah!" The Countess suddenly let out a scream. She looked at the young mage as if she had seen a ghost. "Ah, why didn't I notice? It really looks like him." "Looks like what? What's wrong?" Brando was baffled. He was a little amused at first. What was funny was that Benninger, who was just performing at the side, had become a clown. But the current situation was a little beyond his expectations. He could not help but turn around and look at his mage attendant as if he was getting to know him again. "The Shire, you seem to be quite famous. Can you explain?" "Ha!" The Shire laughed dryly. "My lord, I think this is just a misunderstanding." "I don't think so." "It's true." "Then you better explain it to them." Brando was suddenly startled. He heard the sound of fighting outside the hall. He immediately stopped. The other party blinked his eyes, which meant, "Let's talk later." The battle had begun. The Shire immediately understood his lord's meaning. He immediately turned around and replied to the captain of the Highland Knight Regiment, "Captain, I think you might have mistaken me for someone else?" The hall was silent again. From the sudden noise to the sudden silence, the change was very natural. "You're mistaken, aren't you?" Knight Bun-Eyed smiled and raised his eyebrows. He wanted to say something, but before he could finish, the entire hall suddenly shook. Bun-Eyed paused and raised his head in confusion. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads. The voice clearly came from above. What happened? Almost immediately, the second tremor came as expected. But this time it was more violent. Most of the people were caught off guard and fell to the ground. What happened? What happened? Is it an earthquake? The hall was in chaos. With a loud crash, the crystal dome of Roxby Hall suddenly broke open. Crystal shards fell and a cold wind blew in. Then, a huge object fell straight down and landed with a loud crash. "Help!" For a moment, the wind and rain outside poured down, but the hall was filled with smoke and dust. The nobles were almost scared to death, and screams immediately rang out. Only Brando saw the object clearly. There was a corpse of a wyvern lying in the middle of the hall. Its neck was broken. It was the Wyvern Knight of the Black Blade Squad. Almost at the same time, Grand Duke Arek's steady and powerful voice sounded. "Kill our way out." Everyone was stunned for a moment, but they immediately reacted. "Knight of the Holy Cathedral, stop Makarov." This was Moro's voice. "Capture Princess Griffine." Benninger screamed. Brando also reacted quickly. He immediately protected Dilfrey with one hand and ordered loudly, "The Shire, kill your way to the princess." The hall was immediately in chaos. Dalit's face was covered in blood. He looked out through the half-broken mask and saw that the world was almost blood-red. Countless birds of prey were flying around. The battlefield in the sky was like a land of death. In the center, the great druid wearing a tree cloak was like a god. Every time he cast a spell, a wooden spear or a rock spike would be formed from his hands, and a large number of wyvern knights would fall from the sky. Great druid, upper gold ranked. Dalit felt a chill in his heart. If not for the voice from the magic crystal, he would have trembled. The cold killing was quickly devouring everyone's will to fight. Third and fourth squads, get into formation. It's Viscount Bowman, the Viscount has charged in. Guards, cover the assault. Roars could be heard from the magic crystal. The wyvern knight was regrouping in midair. They were preparing for the final battle. Wyverns were not suitable for fighting in midair for long periods of time, especially when they were carrying the same weight as the knight. Damn those southerners. Dalit gritted his teeth. But this was the final attack. In front, Viscount Kutstar Bowman's wyvern was charging forward. The strength of an intermediate gold ranked was on full display. It was like a comet in the sky. The wyvern knight's eyes were filled with fanaticism. They followed closely behind. The arrow was ready and the encirclement was close. Although the wyvern knight had suffered heavy losses, the enemy was also at their wits' end. The scales of victory were tilted. Look below. Reinforcements are here. An excited voice came from the magic crystal again. Dalit turned his head and saw a red dot rising in the port of Ampere Seal. The Knight Regiment of the Holy Cathedral of Fire stationed in the port, had moved. The Holy Cathedral of Fire had joined the battle. Suddenly he just wanted to shout excitedly. It was a battle to his heart's content. But was the enemy a respectable opponent? Probably. Dalit's mind was filled with chaotic thoughts. He unconsciously glanced to the side, and then his vision was forever fixed in that direction. West of Ampere Seal. In the direction of the Erect Mountains. A black dot was rapidly approaching. Left wing, a large number of unknown air units have been discovered on the left wing. I repeat, all units, a large number of unknown air units have been discovered on the left wing. A stuttering voice came from the magic crystal. Wait. No, the other party is also a wyvern knight? Reinforcements? Everyone was stunned. Where did the reinforcements come from? But only Dalit's pupils constricted. His eyesight was excellent, and he could see the other party's origin and designation from afar. That was not reinforcements at all. It's the enemy attack. He suddenly grabbed the magic crystal and screamed. It's the Southern Legion. It's the wyvern cavalry of the Southern Legion. Prepare to meet the enemy. At that moment he suddenly understood. The Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was not here to support them at all. They were here to meet the Southern Legion, but why would the Southern Legion appear here? Martha Buff. In the midst of the storm. Nosida stood upright on his mount like a javelin, allowing the wind and rain to blow on his face. Lightning flashed and thunder lit up his eyes, but his heart was as calm as an ancient well. He subconsciously touched his cheek. The injury he suffered in the loop of trade winds had left him with a permanent scar, but then he felt relieved. A scar was a warrior's medal. At least he had returned to the Southern Legion. He looked back and saw that the wyvern beside him was carrying the same number of tree-elf archers. The other party responded with a nod. They were once comrades who fought side by side, and now they were going to work together again. It was just that their target was no longer the calamity of wolves. Yes, the kingdom had abandoned them. But the Southern Legion could not abandon their homeland. Nosida raised his spear and pointed it forward. Dragoons, listen to my command. Attack formation. Target Black Blade Squad. For Erwin, advance. A huge arrow was formed in the air. Southern Legion, advance. Everyone knew that Erwin's civil war had officially begun. In a cloud of dust, Brando faced his first opponent, a knight of the Holy Cathedral. When he saw the other party was fighting Maynard. In fact, the black-haired female knight was losing ground. But she could not afford to be careless, because Princess Griffine was just one step behind her. Seeing this, Brando did not hesitate and stabbed his sword. Brando's swordsmanship had always been fierce and barbaric, and this attack was no exception. He did not care about aristocratic etiquette at all. It was almost similar to a sneak attack. The Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was a powerhouse with elemental activation, but they could not do anything in the face of such a persistent attack. They could only turn their swords around to save her. With a clang, the two swords clashed and both swords were pushed back. Maynard finally found a chance to take a step back. She covered her mouth with her hand and coughed out blood. She gasped and immediately looked up at Brando with a pale face. The swordsmanship. Who taught you? We'll talk about it later. Maynard gritted her teeth but still nodded. The knight of the Holy Cathedral had already noticed Brando. In fact, the other party obviously recognized him. His eyes under the metal mask flashed with a cold light. Brando immediately felt the air around him stagnate slightly, and even his movements slowed down. Be careful, his element should be related to wind. Maynard immediately reminded. The female knight's voice was cold, but there was still a little concern in it. This voice made Brando feel a little excited. So similar. So similar to Senior. If Senior Sister is still here, if she was still in this world, Senior Sister. Brando could not help but close his eyes. For a moment, he felt that his perception seemed to extend endlessly along his sword. It was obviously dark, but all the scenery seemed to be in front of him. Bit by bit. A world made of laws. A towering wall appeared in front of him just like that. The elemental wall. Brando's heart trembled. He suddenly opened his eyes and everything in his eyes was different. The deepest part of his eyes seemed to be burning with a silver flame. Countless laws of the world, meaning, and the ultimate fate of all things were evolving in an infinite direction. How was this possible? He raised his sword. Wind elemental bind. The most secondary elemental. You want to bind me with this? It's just a bug. An incomparably confident voice seemed to be above all things. Brando raised his sword with one hand and swung it. The Temple Knight's sword had just arrived. When the two swords clashed, it was as if Brando had casually thrown out a spark. The sword in the Temple Knight's hand flew out of his hand. The Temple Knight was shocked. He never dreamed that there would be such a freak who could touch the elemental wall in the middle of a battle. Brando's sword was not his own strength, but the power of the law itself. As soon as he woke up, this sword was born from the world of the law. Impossible to resist. However, the Temple Knight was one of the top fighting forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. As soon as the sword left his hand, he immediately reacted and retreated as fast as lightning. Brando leveled his sword and slashed horizontally. The tip of the sword missed the opponent by a hair. But it was exactly so. A dash. The Temple Knight suddenly let out a scream of disbelief. He covered his chest with one hand. There was a wound on his breastplate that was neither too deep nor too shallow, and blood was flowing out. Brando raised his head, his heart was already ecstatic. His eyes flashed with a terrifying light. Surefire hit. P.S. Surefire hit. Looking for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 575. The flying dust stopped for a moment, and a layer of golden lines floated in this vast and enclosed space. With Brando as the center, the other end was connected to the laws of the whole world. It only flashed for a moment and disappeared in a flash. This was element. At the same time, Brando's element status column extended down a branch, and there was a small line of attributes above it. Sure hit. As long as the lines of law are stable, the caster can make the next attack appear at any coordinate in space. Activating this authority requires 50 order power. Old friend, we finally meet again. Brando almost looked at this attribute with some nostalgia. Element, in fact, was the power of the law. There was a leap from the peak of gold to the elemental realm. It surpassed all levels of power in the mortal world, and built an insurmountable gap between the two. This gap was even far beyond the gap between gold and silver, and the gap between silver and iron. Among the mortals, only a few geniuses could finally touch the elemental wall and master this power. But once this power was mastered after crossing the gap, it was another world. There was a consensus among the players in his previous life. The first page of the Amber Sword's history was truly opened when the first player reached level 55, 1, to Elemental Awakening. In fact, this level fluctuated according to the part-time job. For this page, Sophie once spent 3.5 years. And at that time the world's number one took 10 months. And this time he took a year. But this was because he took a big detour in Tonagel and was distracted by the layout. For the same reason, he could fully estimate that his actual combat power was far beyond the so-called number one in the world at that time. Brando gently raised the blade, the tip of the sword pointed at the opposite knight, the dark blade of Howran Gaia faintly resonating with the space around it. Words were law and cause and effect were reversed. Among the elements, must-hit had many manifestations, but his must-hit was obviously not one of them. Instead, it had a distinct spatial characteristic. The spatial element, this was almost one of the strongest elements. How could Brando not be happy? This was many times stronger than his element in his previous life. His previous life's elemental attributes could not be compared to this. Could it be that transmigration could change the elemental attributes of one's face? The soul named Sophie could not help but feel envious of Brando, although it seemed a little strange to be jealous of himself. However, he felt that it was a pity. In the stage of elemental awakening, the upper limit of order power was 100, and using a sure hit would consume half of it. The previous sword strike was an unconscious attack after leaving the world of laws. Otherwise, the Temple Knight's head would have fallen to the ground if he was caught off guard. If he missed this opportunity, it wouldn't be so easy in the future. Even though he could make his sword appear at any point in space with just a thought, the prerequisite was that the lines of law had to be stable. Brando looked up and saw that the golden lines of law that he controlled and only he could see could not be stable over an infinite distance. In fact, beyond 50 meters, the lines of law that weaved the world would gradually dim. At the same time, where these golden lines approached the Temple Knight, there were also distortions. This meant that there were places where the lines of law overlapped and intersected with the Temple Knights. This was because the Temple Knight was also a powerhouse in the elemental realm. He had even activated his elemental attributes and was stronger than him. If not for the fact that the space elemental attribute was too strong and he was caught off guard, it would be difficult for him to kill with one blow. Of course, a sure hit was a sure hit. With such a strong elemental attribute, it was easy for him to hurt the Temple Knight. However, in order to add another scar to the Temple Knight, he would have to use up all the remaining order power. Brando had not lost his mind to this point. Unfortunately, this is only the active ability of elemental awakening. If I could actively manipulate the elements, with the strength of the space elemental attribute, I could have a fair fight with the Temple Knight. But that would have to wait until after elemental awakening. He withdrew his sword and immediately helped Maynard, who was half kneeling beside him, up. The female knight snorted softly with a cold face and frowned. She seemed to be in pain. She had to stop a Temple Knight with the strength of a gold ranker. Obviously she was injured badly. Although Maynard was not related to him in any way, Brando always felt that he was supporting his senior. When he thought about how the Temple Knight was so merciless to a woman, especially to a Temple Knight, Maynard was almost unarmed, he could not help but glare at the Temple Knight. Without a doubt, if not for the fact that he could not beat the Temple Knight, Brando would have rushed up with Haurangaya for another 300 rounds. The Temple Knight on the other side had obviously sensed that Brando was not to be trifled with. He covered his wound with one hand and took a step back vigilantly. He had never seen a freak who could touch the elemental wall in battle. There was no record of such a freak in the thousands of years of history of the temple. Moreover, he did not take a step back to let Brando and the princess escape. At this time, the hall had already fallen under the control of the temple. A large hole had been smashed open in the crystal dome of Roxby Palace. It looked like a lifeless eye, indifferently looking at the gloomy sky outside. Rainwater slid down the crystal dome, forming layers of texture when seen from below. The water flowed through the broken section, drooping down several dirty waterfalls. The water splashed across the ground, and the smoke and dust in the hall quickly settled in the muddy water. The water on the ground was already half an inch deep, and there were toppled chairs everywhere. Around the hall, there were already monk soldiers pouring in from outside. The sword hero Nicholas of the Cipher royal family and curiosity seeker Garlock guarded the two side doors on the left and right. Behind them, there was another temple knight guarding the main door. Including Archbishop Moros, there were 5 elemental realm powerhouses in this hall alone. Not to mention, there was also the elemental awakened veteran general of Black Blade, Gerald, who could be considered half an elemental realm powerhouse. Brando supported Maynard, while the princess and Oberway stood behind him. The royal faction stood on the other side, led by Makarov and Fleetwood, with Buga as their bodyguard. They could be considered as having 2 elemental realm powerhouses. It was a pity that Freya did not have the qualifications to enter the temple, or else she would be able to intimidate these people. Brando looked around and saw many familiar faces in the crowd. These people were all famous NPCs in the game. Most of them were gold-ranked powerhouses in the north, and the weakest was at the peak of silver-ranked. He had dealt with these people many times in the past or did quests under them. After all, most of the gold-ranked powerhouses were nobles with fiefs, and their titles were not low. Other than Coden, most of the people under Count Randner were retainers of high status. In the early days of the game, the player's status was far inferior to these NPCs, and it was normal for them to make a living under them. It was just that he did not expect that in today's Ampere Seal, These people would become complete cannon fodder and side characters. Brendel could not help but feel a little emotional for a moment. The hall was silent for a moment, and only the sound of water could be heard. The nobles who had nothing to do with today's matter, such as the envoys under Duke Grenoires and Duke Viro, were all pale with fright. They probably expected the situation to change, but they did not expect both sides to turn hostile so quickly. At this moment, they were chased to the side by the monk soldiers and did not dare to make a sound. They could only watch the changes in the hall. Only the Highland Knight and his men stood in the middle of the hall with one-eyed. Only they did not have a single monk soldier beside them. Brando could not help but sigh. As expected, powerful people were powerful everywhere. As for Duke Arek, he did not even know where he was. He must have killed his way out in the chaos and did not want to get involved in this mess. With the strength of the Eagle Swordsman and the Silver Knight beside him, there was probably no one who could stop them outside the Holy Cathedral. Then Brando saw Dilfrey. This Countess Yenbao's daughter was not too frightened under the protection of Andrique. Not to mention she also had 3 gold-ranked guards by her side. In fact, there were more than 10 gold-ranked warriors in the royal faction, including him and the Sword Guardian family. However, the number of elemental realm powerhouses was too low. Brando knew this very well. Everyone present had seen the situation clearly. The new Archbishop of Anderla Cathedral, Moros, was naturally aware of the situation. Therefore, other than his cold expression, he was calm and seemed to be somewhat fearless. He stood at his original position with 2 high priests on his left and right, motionless. He raised his head and glanced at the Highland Knights at the side, then turned his head. Obviously, this archbishop did not intend to provoke these troublemakers. In his opinion, Duke Karsuk was fine, but the Highland Knight was the real troublesome opponent. They were backed by the Black Tower sorcerers. You say you don't know what the Black Tower sorcerers are? Then you must know that the dozens of floating cities in the sky are not just used to build floating gardens. Obviously, Duke Karsuk sent these Highland Knight to this meeting to discuss them. This duke had always been rebellious towards the central government. He knew this, but he did not want to participate in the intrigue of this kingdom. Moros glanced at Duke Cypher, who was beside him. The duke's expression was not good. Only then did he turn around and look at the princess. Your Highness, the situation is very clear. Now what do you have to say? The head ritual master said slowly. Where is Benninger? Princess Griffin frowned and asked. She silently counted the people in the hall, but did not see the face that she hated the most. The half-elf princess's face was cold. She did not hate the archbishop for lying to her, but the fact that her brother was still in the archbishop's hands. Thinking of this, she gritted her teeth. In order to protect the safety of the witness, he has been sent to a safe place. Moros replied without changing his expression. If it was an ordinary person, he would not mind sending him out to vent the princess's anger if she agreed to his next request. But this person was different. First of all, he was the youngest son of Duke Cypher. More importantly, he was his own identity and status. He shook his head and replied, Your Highness, please do not be stubborn. No, Lord Officiant, there's a problem here, a voice suddenly said. Actually, it's like this. I think the issues that everyone wants to discuss are too complicated, but it's almost time for breakfast. Your Highness is still growing. I think you should send us out for breakfast and continue this meeting to show the etiquette of a host. Everyone was slightly stunned at first. Interrupting in this kind of situation was not a standard thing to do. Everyone present could not help but look for the person who did not follow the etiquette of a noble. But when the person finished speaking, everyone could not help but be stunned. Even Grenoires and the nobles under Duke Viro could tell that this was not a discussion about breakfast. Someone actually dared to joke about the archbishop at this time. Was he crazy? Even the leader of the Highland Knight could not help but raise his eyebrows and look over with a face full of surprise. In fact, everyone's eyes were focused on the aid of Count Yenbao because the person who spoke was Brando. If Moros's face was cold before, it was now so cold that it was almost dripping with water. He looked at Brando as if he was looking at a dead man and said, Sir, if you think that mocking me before you die will make you feel better, I don't mind if you say a few more words. He shook his head contemptuously and said, I have seen many cultists. Most of them are people like you who only know how to talk. Brando smiled slightly and said, No, 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 you are mistaken, Archbishop. What I said just now was not for you. What I am going to say next is for you. I just don't know if you want to listen. Of course not, Duke Cypher, whose face was green with anger, finally interrupted. He first looked at the Highland Knight and said sarcastically, Do you know who the Archbishop is? How can she listen to your nonsense here? He was just casually reprimanding Moros. But he did not expect Brendel to suddenly stop talking and turn around to look at him coldly. At that moment, the Grand Duke felt as if the air around him had been sucked away, as if countless sharp blades were piercing his body, and infinite layers of space were pressing down on him. Duke Cypher felt as if the end of the world had arrived, and he could not help but scream in fear. If not for Marquis Yoakum supporting him from the side, he would have fallen into the dirty water. Brando looked at him and Yoakum behind him and said coldly, "Clowns, you have done a disgraceful thing and you will pay for it later." Yoakum was also shocked. Although Brando did not say it, it seemed to be hinting at something. He was faintly uneasy and thought of the matter with Princess Magadal. He lowered his head and wondered if he should confirm with Archbishop Moros later. It was at this moment that the Archbishop exclaimed softly. He raised his hand and cut off the line of sight between Brendel and Duke Cypher. At first, he did not notice that Brendel had the ability to manifest his elemental powers. In fact, Brendel had already used the power of his elemental powers in that glance. For an ordinary person like Duke Cypher, he only needed to move the line of law slightly to scare him to death. But if the opponent was someone with outstanding strength like Erek, it would be difficult to do so. Of course, if Brando wanted to use his absolute hit ability, he could kill someone with elemental powers within 50 meters, even if they were at the pinnacle of gold. Humph, Moros snorted coldly, showing off just because you are a little smart. You're just a junior. I would like to see what you have to say to me. Brando spread out his hands. I am not the one who provoked you first, Archbishop. But what I want to say to you is, before you think of getting rid of us, you should consider your own safety first. His own safety? Moros could not help but feel a little amused. In fact, he was sneering. Of course, it could not be ruled out that Brando was hiding his strength. Otherwise, it would be impossible to explain how his strength had increased so quickly. But as an elemental realm priest, how could he be killed by 4 elemental powerhouses? Even the strongest of the officiators in the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not have such strength. But before he could retract his sneer, just as Brando finished his last word, he suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. Since Moros had reached this point in his life, he had encountered at least 800 big and small dangers. For someone like him, no matter how terrible the crisis was, he wouldn't be afraid. But this time, Moros had an illusion that he was being targeted by a terrible giant beast and would die in the next moment. He had not had such a premonition for many years. His expression changed and he subconsciously turned his head. But there were too many people around and someone had already shouted, "Look over there, who is that?" Moros saw a hand reaching out from the void beside Brando. This hand was lifting a piece of cloth. To be exact, it was a cloak. Giant's cloak? He was quite knowledgeable and recognized it at a glance. But the next moment, the Archbishop could not help but jump up. Not only him, but all the high-ranking priests and knight from Cruz could not help but show a look of fear. This is impossible. Mephisto. Ash Sword Saint. Long time no see, Moros. This time I have a gift for you people from Cruz. A middle-aged man smiled at them as if he was harmless. But in the next moment, a terrible power spread out from his body and shrouded the entire hall in an instant. Everyone's expression changed. This was the most powerful aura in the mortal world. P.S. I was stuck in the morning and wanted to take a break to find some inspiration. But after thinking about it, I decided that it would be better to write a chapter every day so that it would not break again. Fortunately, I finally finished it. Sure enough, people still have to force themselves. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 576. Back in the Black Forest, Mephisto's power was far from what it was today. He could barely hold on in front of Endesha, the Lord of Withering, who controlled the elemental realm. But after the battle with Endesha, his understanding of the Grey Realm deepened. He broke through the peak of elemental activation and entered the ultimate realm. According to Brando's knowledge, this prodigy sword saint would only reach this level in about 5 years. At this rate, it was not impossible for him to enter the Sage Realm in the Great Era. Elemental 5 realms. Elemental activation, elemental truth, ultimate realm, Sage Realm. Since the earliest era, Tiamat, the law of the world and magic, had written down such rules. After the elemental activation, those who passed through the 5 worlds were like travelers. Only after passing through them one by one could they reach the ultimate realm that Martha called. The first world, Justo's Wall of Truth and Thorns, was the wall of elemental elements. Only by passing through this long wall on the line of law of the world could one reach the first world. Mortals called it elemental activation, a world that touched upon the truth. The second world, White Tower, Ovilia. Legend has it that the White Tower supported all the order in Wonde. It was the beginning and end of all the lines of law. All the laws formed a circle called the world, with it as the center. Martha wrote down all the truths and laws on the White Tower. Travelers climbed up the White Tower and understood the true meaning of the world one by one. It was like a child and an elder walking hand in hand. Mortals called it elemental truth. The third world, Spiral Peak, Holy Mountain Yggdrasil, the place where all the truth was born. Above the White Tower, a huge spiral was completely opposite to the White Tower. It was a place of chaos. Pale Poem described it as Martha's hometown. This was the place where chaos and order were in harmony. The world was black on the top and white on the bottom, coexisting. Fragments of the old world floated in the endless distortion. Wonde was rooted in this soil, and at the same time, it deduced the past, present, and future. After mastering the ultimate realm, one would enter the ultimate realm, the sacred palace. The fourth world, the final plains. This was the place where Martha had created the Wonde. Now, there was only a gray-white plain, and the most primitive power and elements were running on the plain. Looking up, the sky was the sea of magic. The sea of magic was magnificent, never stopping and always flowing in one direction. It was the direction of time, space, and all kinds of energy. This was also the lowest level world closest to Wonde. It could be said that it was the shadow of Wonde. Finally, the fifth world, the Lake of Beginnings, the place where life was first born. Legend had it that this place was connected to the abyss pool of the blind goddess Irene. Thus, it could reveal all secrets and truths, even the future. Only by reaching this place would a mortal be able to return to their original self, transcend mortality, and step into the realm of true saints. It was what mortals called the sage domain. Of course, he didn't really want to reach these worlds. But as his power grew, he would gradually see these scenes in his spiritual world. Just like when Brando touched the elemental wall, the invisible wall of laws did exist in his spiritual world. Now he had one foot in the door of transcendence. In fact, after the battle with Endesha, he saw the ultimate meaning of the Spiral Peak. The ultimate realm had long since opened its doors to him. The ultimate meaning of the gray element. He stood there with his famous greatsword still in its sheath. He smiled at the two high-ranked priests of Cruz, the two knight of the Holy Cathedral and Archbishop Moros. But it was as if the world had turned into a colorless gray. In this gray world there was no black and white, no two opposite poles. There was no such thing as time flowing or not flowing, and there was no such thing as death or existence. Everything was in a state between two extremes. Thus, Mephisto didn't care whether he was attacking or defending. In his law, life and death were nothingness and existence was meaningless. He just stood there in front of Moros, and the Archbishop felt his hair stand on end. He felt as if he would turn into ashes with a single glance. His existence was even more worthless than ashes. The ultimate realm? Moros' expression changed. "Why am I here, Moros? You know best." Mephisto did not answer. Instead he said, "When my country died, I knew where you were." Upon hearing this, the Archbishop of Anderla Cathedral knew that there was no going back. "Mephisto, it's not too late to regret." He winked at his subordinates. The Holy Cathedral Knight received the order and stabbed Mephisto with his sword. But the Grey Sword Saint did not seem to see it. The sword pierced through his body. "Petty tricks won't save you, Moros. Today you're dead." Everyone saw this strange scene clearly. In a world of gray, just a moment ago they were still in the hall of Roxby Palace, but in the next moment, the whole world seemed to have turned into a grayish-white wilderness. The Grey Sword Saint was in the middle of the field. The Holy Cathedral Knight stabbed him as if he had stabbed a piece of paper or an illusion. But Mephisto's illusion was still talking. Eden Rant, the Wind Knight of the Holy Cathedral. What a great reputation. He waved his hand, and the great sword on his back drew an unparalleled arc in the air. Although it felt like an illusion, the paladin's arm that was holding the great sword was sent flying high into the air with a dull thud. Countless droplets of blood spurted out. The Holy Cathedral Knight screamed and hurriedly used his remaining arm to protect his body. The sky-blue lines of law extended along his arm and weaved into a huge shield. The wind was soft and as sharp as steel, but it could not save his life. Mephisto's gray sword slid down his arm. Wherever it passed, the sky-blue lines of law were assimilated and disintegrated. If time does not flow, the wind will naturally stop as well. Mephisto stabbed the knight's heart. 2/3 of the blade went in, and the tip of the sword even pierced the knight's back armor. Eden Rant struggled futilely like a lobster on a skewer. Gurgling sounds came from his mouth. Then his head fell to the side and he lost all signs of life. A dignified elemental paladin from the Holy Cathedral was killed on the spot without even taking a single blow. Almost everyone present except Brendel swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Now, Moros growled, I hold the holy commandment in my hand. In the name of the Lord of Flames, diffuse, I command this pure fire to purify all sins in the world. He pointed forward, and the temperature in Roxby Hall suddenly rose. The ground in the hall seemed to crack, and the water in the hall instantly evaporated into white smoke. The ground rumbled and golden rays of light shot out from the cracks. The marble pillars of the Anderla Cathedral cracked, and under the ground, a sea of magma gushed out. In an instant the hall looked like hell. Flame of sin. Brando and Greysword Saint Mephistopheles cursed in their hearts at the same time. They were probably the only ones who knew what was going on. One of them had 2 lifetimes of experience, while the other had been enemies with Cruz and the Holy Cathedral of Fire all year round. Naturally, they could tell that Moros's holy spell was the 10th circle spell, Flame of Sin. Once this spell was cast, the Anderla Great Temple would be reduced to the dust of history. Brando cursed in his heart, but this was probably not the time to curse. He immediately pulled Maynard and Princess Griffin back. The ground in front of them cracked inch by inch and golden flames spewed out from the ground. Everything touched by the flames turned into ashes in an instant. Fortunately, he reacted quickly, but the noble envoys on the other side were not so lucky. Most of them were caught in the flames at the first moment and turned into ashes while screaming. The Shire reacted quickly as a mage. He cast a protective spell to protect the people around him. However, protective spells were not omnipotent. The sea of fire was approaching step by step, and in the blink of an eye, it would surround them. The Shire. Brando quickly shouted, blow this cathedral up. The Shire was stunned. Sir, are you sure? This cathedral is a priceless treasure. It was built a few centuries ago. It was the painstaking effort of a master craftsman. It is an artistic treasure in the history of Erewhon. Mr. Brando, you can't do that. Princess Griffin could not help but scold him. Stop talking nonsense, blow it up. Brando thought to himself. Besides, Moros seemed to be ready to tear this place down. If they did not tear it down now, it would probably be torn down by him. I understand. The Shire immediately became serious. He looked up at the crystal dome of the cathedral and raised a hand. The law of destruction, the authority of Tiamat, the dragon of war, dragon strike. A light green beam of light appeared in his outstretched palm. This beam of light seemed to penetrate the dome of Roxby Hall. With the Shire's palm as the center, the other end connected to the dark clouds in the sky. The next moment, the flow of time slowed down. Space rapidly condensed in the center of his palm until it formed a singularity. In an instant, a bright white light burst out from that singularity. The entire space seemed to have undergone a strange expansion. Then a huge shockwave appeared. Everyone who wasn't affected by the flames subconsciously looked up, only to see that the entire upper half of the Anderla Cathedral seemed to have been blown apart by the shockwave. The stones, wood, tiles, glass, and crystals seemed to have been disintegrating in all directions before exploding in a single explosion. Boom. Looking from a few miles away, even the whole of Ampere Seal witnessed the explosion. Everyone in the port and above the port could not help but stop and stare dumbfoundedly as more than half of the Anderla Cathedral was blown apart. Roxby Hall was now an open-air pile of rubble. Everyone in the hall stiffly retracted their gazes and looked at the young man who caused all this. Brando, you. Princess Griffin bit her lower lip. Her face was pale and she almost fainted from anger. Brando could not help but facepalm. The Shire, I asked you to blow up Roxby Hall, not the entire Anderla Cathedral. But you said to blow up the cathedral, my lord? The Shire was extremely innocent. This is a misunderstanding. Brando looked at Griffin guiltily. The future Princess Regent was so angry that she could not speak. The Anderla Cathedral was one of Erewhon's most precious cultural relics. Most importantly, this cathedral was built on the site of the former King Eric's palace. It's all right. Besides, isn't there still half of it left? The Shire replied very optimistically. But before he could finish, there was a loud bang and a column of magma spewed out from the ground. Next, countless amounts of fire and magma spewed out from the rubble. In the blink of an eye, the remaining structure of the Anderla Cathedral was caught in a sea of fire. The ground was still trembling and roaring. It was obvious that the true power of the level 10 spell was still buried deep underground, ready to unleash its final fury on the cathedral. Brando's face suddenly changed. Quick, leave this place. In fact, there was no need for him to remind them. In the hall, if there was still a hall, the remaining people had already begun to panic and were pushing each other to escape. "Wait, what about that, uncle?" Dilfrey asked loudly. Brando glanced at the sea of fire. The flames had completely covered the figures of Moros and the Ash Sword Saint. He shook his head. "Don't worry, Moros is still not his match. The ones who should be worried are us." "Us?" Brando nodded seriously. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 577. Moros, you've gone mad. I'm not the mad one, Mephistopheles. Do you think you can destroy everything? You're wrong. You can't do anything. Archbishop Moro's robe fluttered in the hot wind, and a sinister smile appeared on his cold face. Don't compare me with those cowards. What you and they are after is not worth mentioning. Haha, my goal is noble. Moros. The Ash Sword Saint rested his sword on his shoulder, and his gray eyes burned with madness. Golden lava spewed out from the ground, but he ignored it. Instead, he bared his white teeth and stared at the archbishop like a wild beast. You've got one thing wrong. I don't care about your goal. I'm only here to kill you. No murderer can go unpunished. I'm not an exception. You're not an exception. Even the Emperor of the Cruz Empire is not an exception. So, the gray-haired man in black raised his sword and pointed it at the stunned Moros. Please go to hell. A gray ripple spread out from the tip of his sword. In an instant, the Roxby Palace and the Anderla Cathedral disappeared. Only a vast gray plain was left between the two men. The flames underground seemed to have lost their last shackles. In an instant, a sea of fire rose from the feet of Moros and Mephistopheles. At this moment, the level 10 spell was finally completed, and it exploded with its greatest power. It was as if a golden flame sword had pierced out from the ground. The blade was hundreds of feet wide and pierced into the sky. A pillar of light could be seen from dozens of miles away. A golden red cross shone in the sky. All of the terrifying power burned away the Ash Sword Saint's robes, revealing his inner armor. The black armor gradually turned golden red, and the gray lines of law flickered. Every line was dazzling, and even his eyebrows and hair were set ablaze, making him look like a man on fire. However, Mephistopheles did not seem to hear it. He stepped out of the flames. The flames burned on his body, but they were cold and had no temperature. His eyes reflected the golden red flames as he approached Moros step by step. He was like a monster that had walked out of the lava pool of hell. The Ash Sword Saint raised his sword, which was covered in a layer of golden red. It had already turned into a huge flaming sword. No, the flames can't hurt you. No, you are protected by the power of this world. Where is this place? Moros screamed. Moros, you could have used your strongest offensive spell and your elemental power. You would have had a chance to win this battle. However, you chose to use this AoE spell. You are too greedy. Mephistopheles shook his head as he walked closer to Moros. The final plane, the gray field. I see. Moros suddenly understood. I see. This is the fourth realm. He suddenly screamed as the Ash Sword Saint's sword stabbed into his chest. The Archbishop, who was in the middle of channeling the spell, could not move at all. The terrifying power of the backlash immediately surged into his body, burning his limbs in an instant. Ah! Moros suddenly laughed. Haha, you think I'm greedy? You're wrong, cough cough. Mephisto, why don't you go and save them? They're dead meat. The Ash Sword Saint looked at him with pity in his eyes. Moros suddenly stopped, and a look of astonishment appeared on his face. What do you mean by that look? Moros. You've underestimated him. The Ash Sword Saint nodded. Moros coughed violently. The light in his eyes was fading rapidly. At the last moment of his life he seemed to see the huge ring again. Everything returns to ring, everything returns to one. The Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire widened his eyes and groaned, Feudal, 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 feudal. Well, I never understand the nature of the world. Brando had just led the princess and the others out of the ruins of the Anderla Cathedral when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned around and saw a group of people in a sea of fire. The leader of the night turned around and saw them. Brando smiled. Breton, we meet again. The young man on the horse also smiled. It has indeed been a long time. I didn't expect to be in the same trench as you this time. Erwin, people should be in the same trench. Brando replied. Breton paused for a moment, then nodded. He dismounted and came to the front of the group. He bowed to Maynard and Princess Griffin. Your Highness, Knight Commander Maynard. What's the situation? Maynard's face was pale, and there were traces of blood at the corner of her mouth. If not for Brando supporting her, she would not have been able to stand, but she still asked. The first to arrive were the guards. Freya and Moke led the students to repel them a few times. Now they have retreated to Juggler Street and 47th Street, but there are no fortifications. They should be waiting for reinforcements. Breton replied proudly. He had a reason to be so. The students of the Royal Knight Academy could be said to be the backbone of the kingdom. They were originally selected from the nobles and the best youths of the guards in the south. After systematic learning and training, they could be said to be the best military talents in Erewhon. This was not a boast. The history that Brando knew also proved this point. This army of officers was the main force of the Princess Regent's future expeditions. What about the patrolling cavalry? What about the Black Blade Squad? Maynard frowned. They won't be coming. Brando interrupted. Sani and his clansmen must have succeeded. Of course, I don't know that the Nagas are attacking the inner city. It's enough to distract the defenders of Ampere Seal by attacking the port. But I don't know that the Nagas are attacking the inner city. It's enough to distract the defenders of Ampere Seal. As for the Black Blade Squad, the Wyvern Knight from both sides were currently engaged in a fierce battle in the sky above Ampere Seal. From time to time, the corpses of wyverns and birds of prey would fall from the sky and shatter into pieces. For Brando, it was actually very easy to convince the Southern Legion. Ironically, because of the situation in Erewhon, the Southern Legion that guarded the borders of the kingdom had fallen into oblivion. In fact, the royal faction had always tacitly allowed Count Randner to collude with Madara. This made the Southern Legion's life even more difficult. In fact, 2 years later, when the current commander of the Southern Legion, Count Lydie, died in battle, the Southern Legion was basically disbanded and erased from history. Later on, when Erewhon was revived, Madara invaded the southern border for the second time, and almost overnight, the Valkyrie was attacked from the back and died in the Crimson Canyon. In fact, a large part of the reason was the evil karma that the royal faction had sowed. The destruction of the Southern Legion in this era was seen as a compromise with Count Randner. Although the royal faction won in the end, it deeply hurt the hearts of the people in the south. Brando naturally would not let this happen again, but he lacked an opportunity. Furthermore, he did not know where the Southern Legion was at this moment. It was not until Nasuda's appearance that a real opportunity presented itself in front of him. Both sides hit it off almost immediately. The Southern Legion that was at the end of their road desperately needed an ally, especially when Brando could use the princess's name. At the same time, unlike the royal faction, he did not have a good impression of Count Randner, so he immediately sold him out. In fact, it could not be said that he sold him out. He and Count Randner were originally mortal enemies, and forming an alliance with the Southern Legion could be said to be killing two birds with one stone. Today, the Southern Legion sent Erewhon's most powerful Wyvern cavalry to support the princess. In fact, it was part of the alliance, but it was far more than that. Brando only thought that Count Randner's good days were coming to an end. But this thought only lasted for a moment because everyone was looking at him at this moment. Our ally is restraining them, Brando immediately replied. Breton, are there any guards at the King's Trail and Forest Avenue? Breton looked at Maynard, while the black-haired female knight looked at Princess Griffin. The half-fairy princess was standing in the middle of the crowd with a rainproof cloak, her face still pale. She nodded. Leave everything to Mr. Brando. But wait a moment. Princess Griffin raised her head and looked at Brando. Mr. Brando, Ampere Seal is a famous city in history, and there are many things that are truly precious to the people of Erewhon other than money and power. If you have no other choice, I hope that you— I know. Brando nodded. It seemed that the destruction of the Anderla Cathedral had caused her to hold a grudge. In fact, it was not only the princess, but he was also heartbroken. Just like what Princess Griffin said, this was a kingdom with a long history, and there were many things that were regarded as spiritual symbols in this land. If they were to completely destroy everything for the sake of victory, the damage to this ancient kingdom and its people would be unimaginable. But war was war, and Brando could only reply, "We will do our best to protect everything, Your Highness. What we want is not a battered Erewhon." Princess Griffin nodded calmly, indicating that she agreed. He turned his head back. Breton glanced at him and nodded in agreement. He was born in Braggs, and there was a famous clock tower in the city of Braggs. Almost everyone who grew up in Braggs had memories of this clock tower since childhood, and they proudly regarded it as the symbol of Braggs. If one day this clock tower were to collapse in the flames of war, he believed that everyone in Braggs would feel sad. Sometimes these spiritual symbols were not only precious treasures, but also symbols of hope. As long as they were still there, Erewhon would eventually rise from the ashes. This was the power of culture, and Breton deeply agreed with this point in his heart. Brando, there are no traces of the guards in the direction of the King's Walk and Forest Avenue, but if we head north, there should be a garrison station near the north gate of Ampere Seal. Although the Anderla Cathedral was located on the central axis of Ampere Seal, it was actually located in the east near the port area, in fact in the center of the old port area. There were 5 main roads that led to the cathedral. The King's Walk and Forest Avenue were north of the cathedral, and the Juggler Street and 47 Avenue were south of the cathedral. There was also Petrol Street that led east to the port of Petrol Fortress. Brando let the Nagas occupy the port, and his actual plan was to let the princess and the rest break through to the north, near the Silver Lighthouse outside the city. There was a ship waiting for them there, and then both sides would leave the Silver Lighthouse Bay and rendezvous in the outer sea of Ampere Seal. This plan seemed extremely bold, but it was full of possibilities. First of all, the north was the hinterland controlled by Duke Cypher, and no one would think that they would break through to the north. Secondly, the sea was raging, and there was almost no possibility of leaving Ampere Seal through the outer sea. But all of this was possible because of the existence of the demon whale. Now it seemed that the other side had indeed deployed a large number of troops in the south gate. After listening to Breton's description, Brando replied, Ampere Seal has nearly 30,000 coast guards, so it's normal for there to be a large group of troops in front of us. He raised his head. How many people do we have? More than 200 cadets under the command of Freya and Mach. 200 against 1,000. Brando silently looked at the darkness in the north. These were the 200 cadets of the Royal Knight Academy, the backbone of Erewhon's resurgence. This elite troop that belonged to Her Royal Highness had shed their last drop of blood in the Second War of the Black Roses, and was completely annihilated in the Crimson Canyon together with the Valkyrie. But in this era of Aween, there was no army that could match them. He raised his head, and the wind and rain in the dark fell on him. Your Royal Highness, please give the order for us to break through to the north and rendezvous with my men. The braziers in Petrol Fortress were burning fiercely, reflecting the faces of everyone who was in a hurry. But this warmth could not dispel the chill in everyone's hearts in the hall. Everyone's face was gloomy. Marquis Urien frowned as he sat at a long table. On the long table was a huge map of the port of Ampere Seal and the nearby areas. There were more and more indicators on the map that represented the enemy. According to the latest round of intelligence, the Nagas had already attacked the trade street along Petrol Avenue. If Petrol Fortress could not stop them, then the inner city would be a smooth path ahead of them. The Marquis rubbed his frowning brows. Let's go out and take a look. After that he stood up, his armor clattering. Before anyone could stop him, the commander of the Coast Guards of Ampere Seal had already pushed open the door with a crash. Outside there was a storm, lightning, and thunder. My lord. Urien was silent. He looked at the rain, and the nearby streets were already filled with people. The flag that represented the Coast Guard still appeared on the main streets near Petrol Avenue, but a few places had already become prominent in the fierce battle. The Nagas' attack was unusually fierce. This was not a robbery at all, but an invasion. Their enemies were soon clear. They were the Grey Fin Nagas Guards. The Grey Fin Nagas Guards were a standard Tier 2 army in the game. Not to mention the Coast Guards of Ampere Seal, even Erewhon's regular army was no match for them. The shining Poseidon scepter was like a sharp sword hanging in everyone's heart, and they were not in the mood to speak at all. In the midst of the silence, there was a blurry darkness further away. Other than the earth-shattering killings that proved that there was a battle in those places, the entire port had become a giant beast that devoured lives. The casualties were heavy. Zenopa Lee and his patrolling cavalry are still holding on, but they won't be able to hold on for much longer. The Marquis turned around. Let Eben and Innes bring their troops to support us. My lord, but the Archbishop has ordered that the defense of the South Gate must not be transferred. I'm in charge here now. The Marquis stood in the rain and interrupted him. He turned around and said word by word, this is Ampere Seal, and the Frata Forest is to the south. The territory of the royal faction is separated by the Erect Mountains. Why do we have to invest so much in the South Gate? Is the royal faction already at our doorstep? But Her Highness, that has nothing to do with us. The Marquis replied coldly. Remember, we are the soldiers of Ampere Seal. Protecting this port is our duty. If the Lord Officiator has any questions, he can come to me. The few knights around him looked at each other for a moment, then looked at each other and bowed deeply to the old soldier who had guarded Ampere Seal for more than 10 years. Finally they left the hall one by one. The Marquis sighed. He placed his hand on the cold battlements and suddenly felt that the kingdom was just like the port, swaying in the dark storm. He could not help but look at the dark sea. A bright light rose from the surface of the sea. Carglass looked at the light and turned around. The White Lion Legion was ready to move out. There were only 100 of them, but they had the aura of 10 million people. It was hard for the average person to believe that this was an army from Tanajul. Less than half a year ago they were just a group of youths from the countryside. His heart was burning with passion. Carglass felt that he had made the most important decision in his life. He did not know if it was right or wrong, but at least he would not regret it. Miss Amandina. I saw it too. Amandina stood in the rain and turned around. Her eyes were dark and gloomy. It's time. You should get ready to move out. Please be sure to escort the Lord back safely. I understand. Carglass, remember, the one who can save Erwin is not the royal faction or the princess, but the Lord. Amandina replied faintly. Carglass paused for a moment. Miss Amandina, do you also think that the Lord should not take this risk? It is not wise, Amandina sighed. But it is precisely because of this that we believe that he can save this dark era. Even if he is clumsy, my father said that some people are born to bring light to others. We follow him. We only hope to see a miracle. That is all. Carglass did not say anything and only nodded seriously. He watched as the weak noble lady turned around and walked back into the house. There seemed to be some kind of determination in her, and the same kind of determination burned in his heart. He turned around. Countless pairs of bright eyes focused on him. Every young person had the same mark on them. They had come here from the loop of trade winds, and they had witnessed a miracle with their own eyes. In the endless darkness of the storm, a pillar of light pierced through the heavens and earth. It was an unforgettable sight. The person who brought light was now in this city. In the midst of this pitch-black windstorm, he raised his sword. Amandina looked at the youths one last time, watching their white armor disappear into the rain one by one. Perhaps they should be called the White Lion Legion now. They carried the ideals of this era, and walked out of a glorious period of history under her leadership. What kind of change would this bring to the kingdom? Or would it be a splash in the long river of history? Amandina silently opened the door and saw the Roman sitting upright. She was originally worried that the young lady would treat Princess Magadal as a toy, but now she could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Roman? Amandina. The Roman said seriously. Yes. Amandina was slightly startled. In her impression, the young lady who always prided herself as a great merchant had never acted like this. Amandina, I'm sorry, Amandina nodded. But the Roman is about to go to Brando. What? Wait, you can't? Amandina was shocked. The young people of the White Lion Legion were about to depart, and they who had no combat ability had to immediately board the ship and meet up with Brando in the open sea. At this time the Roman must not be in any trouble. But before she could finish speaking, she suddenly found that she could not move. Roman, you despicable. Amandina listened to the Roman. The Roman stared into Amandina's eyes, giving her a fright. She had never seen him like this before. Brando is in danger. This is a trap and only the Roman can help him. Amandina, so the Roman is about to leave. I'll leave Princess Magadal to you, please take good care of her. This is the mission Brando gave to the little Roman, and now the little Roman is passing it to you. When the young lady finished speaking, she had already pushed the door open and left. Amandina only heard her last sentence. Sister White, let's go. Please hurry, Princess Magadal told me that there is not much time left. Her face was pale. P.S. A 6,000-word chapter. Because the plot is together, I did not separate it. You know what I mean. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 578. Hundreds of soldiers stood silently in the pouring rain. The rainwater stirred up a layer of dense mist on the dark tower shields. The long spears emitting a cold metallic light extended forward one after another, silently forming a steel forest on the square of evergreen trees. The captain of the 7th Swordsman Brigade of Ampere Seal's Coast Guards, Sir Malosir, finally let out a sigh of relief. He tried his best not to think about the pale faces under the steel helmets and the crooked formation. In any case, they had finished setting up the defense within the estimated time. He turned around and gave a knight's salute to the young man behind him. General, it's done. Owen stared at the gloomy sky above the harbor. The Black Blade Squad and the Holy Cathedral's Air Force stationed in Ampere Seal did not have the upper hand. Their opponents were too strong. The Southern Legion had always had the strongest dragon cavalry in Erewhon, but such a force was easily abandoned by the kingdom in another period of history. He could not see that future, but now the two armies fighting in the sky above Ampere Seal were the same kingdom's two armies. Perhaps they should have gone for more valuable victories, to face Cruz and Madara, to face more glorious opponents. He retracted his gaze and looked at the line of defense that took more than half an hour to build. He could not help but shake his head. Such a line of defense was like a thin piece of paper in front of the White Lion Legion. It would be torn apart by the wind and rain. But after all, this was the wealthiest area in the kingdom. The soldiers here did not have to face Cruz's people in the north, nor did they have to fight the undead of Madara. Their opponents were not barbarians, nor were they mountain people. It was already good enough that they could achieve this. This was the kingdom's second-rate army. Owen was also aware of this fact. He nodded expressionlessly. Yes. Sir Malosur secretly wiped the sweat off his forehead. He was glad that he had passed the test. In fact, he did not think much of it. The royal faction was not stupid. Why would they come to the north and walk into a trap? But the opponent was an officer of the White Lion Legion. It was common knowledge that any noble commander in the White Lion Legion was a prominent figure in the kingdom, or an outstanding descendant of a big family. The young man in front of him was probably the latter. He could not afford to offend these people. Owen saw Malosur's nonchalant expression, and his disdain for him deepened. They were all shallow people. He raised his head and looked in front of him. On the other side of the curtain of rain was the last force of the royal faction. What kind of army was the royal faction's students? I hope he won't disappoint me. Owen was eager to give it a try. Amidst the rain, Ampere Seal was still dark, but it was almost dawn. Durak, Mare, Ken, 4th years, gather here. The young officer on the warhorse raised the black war flag high, like a totem standing in the wind and rain. The young people from the royally non-commissioned official academy quickly separated into groups. Their movements were uniform and well-trained. In the pouring rain, there was only the sound of footsteps and the occasional clash between scabbards and leather boots. Ahead of them, they passed through the continuous line of rain. The scouts and cavaliers were intertwining with each other as they sent back information. Captain Knight, we have encountered an unknown enemy ahead. They're blocking our way. In the wind and rain, the knight pointed behind him. There's one in all three directions. Continue scouting. Extend to the left and right. Maynard replied coldly. She pulled on the reins of her horse. Brando, who was beside her, also pulled on the reins. Both of their war horses immediately stopped. Brando looked ahead. Raindrops slid down his pale forehead like water droplets on a statue. He raised his hand and drew a line in front of him. This army is spreading out from Lion Street, Hawkfens into Silversmith Bridge. There are 2 platoons of more than 500 people in front. They don't have any reserves, so they're probably not a regular army. Before he finished his sentence, a voice came from afar. Look carefully. The emblem of the Black Spider. It's the Northern Barbarians' private army. The Hellion family is Rodu's private army. These clowns want a piece of the pie. Oberway, who was behind Maynard, couldn't help but snort coldly. Everyone's eyes focused on Brando. How do you know? Maynard turned her head. Her wet hair stuck to her jade-like forehead. Her body was as straight as a sword in the heavy rain. Her expression was cold and indifferent. Her eyes were dark and full of suspicion. But all of this was to cover up the slight trembling caused by the pain. Brando did not answer. He just stood still on the horse. Suddenly there was a rustling sound in the rain. The dense sky-blue spiders turned from translucent to visible to the naked eye. They moved forward from behind along the road. Brando and his horse stood in the middle of this blue sea. The sea current submerged their 4 hooves. Wind spirit spiders, so many. There were many knowledgeable nobles in the crowd. They recognized the spiders at a glance and couldn't help but exclaim. Shut up and keep quiet. Mach, one of the 3 knight, couldn't help but scold. He was a young man with short gray hair. His eyebrows were very short, like 2 caterpillars. When he frowned, he looked funny and cute. Freya and Breton at the side couldn't help but smile. The girl in the blue uniform raised her head and looked at Brando in admiration. Behind her, the Knight of the Lake silently rode on his horse and looked at Brando. Maynard's dark eyes showed a trace of surprise. She seemed to have sensed something and asked, You use them to investigate? I can only give simple orders to determine the position of the enemy in front. But Brando looked at the rain and shook his head disdainfully. I'm too familiar with the tricks of those guys. Yes, compared to the future Madara, it's really not worth mentioning. Brando closed his eyes. The Iron Horse Glacier of the past seemed to be in front of him. The army of the undead rushed towards him, and behind him was the abyss of fire. There was no way out. Is that so? If you were the commander, what are you going to do now? Oberwei, the Wolf Knight, was already dressed in military attire. He pulled out his sword and asked as if they were chatting. The lone wolf turned his head. Griffin let Brando take charge of the current situation, but in fact the command of the Royal Knight Academy was still in his hands. The middle-aged man's sunken eyes were filled with a pair of firm eyes. It was easy to feel the power contained in them. We don't have time to tangle with these rascals. Brando opened his eyes. There are many two-faced guys around. We have to completely dispel their thoughts. Kill the chicken to warn the monkey, Oberwei smiled. It seems that you have a lot of confidence in these young people. Brando looked back. He saw more than 200 young men and women. The night uniforms of these young people were already soaked, and their hair was wet, but only their eyes were still shining. I have confidence in people with ideals, Brando replied. Of course, he only said it with a strong sense of righteousness. If there was no history as a witness, Brando would not be so arrogant. But he knew that he had to convince Oberwei, the actual teacher of Her Royal Highness, and also the pillar of the princess's party. The lone wolf of the kingdom showed a look of appreciation. He turned back and silently looked at the young people behind him. Most of these young people were personally selected by him from all over the country. For example, Freya, Breton, and some from the most loyal families of the royal family. Although they were the descendants of some small noble families, they were often the most outstanding and had the most firm beliefs. Young people like Moke were the representatives of these young people. These young people were the last hope of the kingdom. The first batch of students of the Royal Knight Academy. Listen to my orders. Oberwei suddenly shouted. His voice spread far and wide with the wind and rain. Brando suddenly laughed in his heart. From now on, you will follow Knight Brendel and fight your way out of the encirclement until Her Highness is safe. Oberwei said coldly, do you understand? There was complete silence. Everyone's eyes suddenly focused on Brando. If there was anyone who had the highest prestige in the hearts of these young people, it would definitely be Her Royal Highness. Next was Maynard. In fact, Maynard had always been their commander. Almost no one dared to oppose the majesty of this female knight. After that, there were a few outstanding people in the first batch, especially Breton and Moke. After Freya obtained the Lionheart sword, her strength and prestige gradually stood out, but most people still regarded her as the assistant of the first two. As for Brando, perhaps before this day, they had never even heard of the existence of such a person. If it was someone like Makarov or Oberwei who was the leader of the royal faction or a veteran general in the army, they might be able to convince the masses. However, Brando was only in his early 20s. It seemed that he was at most the son of a noble. What qualifications did he have to command them? Perhaps he had shown some of his skills before, but that was just a summoner trick. It was nothing in this battlefield. Since ancient times, a strong army had its own pride. Even though these youths had not seen the real big picture, they were still outstanding among their peers. Even if they did not dare to directly disobey the order, no one dared to make a sound at this moment. They only waited for Brendel to make a decision. Freya immediately became nervous. Breton glanced at Brando but did not express his opinion. The young man called Moke also stared coldly at Brando like the rest. Brando did not express his opinion. Instead, he directly gave an order. He spurred his horse forward, then turned back and coldly ordered, the people blocking the princess's path are just chickens and dogs. Your mission now is to teach them an unforgettable lesson. But we don't have much time, so you only have a short period of time to learn this lesson. Learn this lesson? Everyone was stunned for a moment, then an uproar broke out. The young officers of the Royal Knight Academy were stunned for a moment before they understood this sentence. This guy actually meant to teach them a lesson. What a big tone. Cavalry assault. Let's not talk about whether this guy had the ability to teach them a lesson. The problem was, did he even have such a cavalry by his side? The competitive spirit of the young people was stirred up. Everyone looked at Brando with amusement, as if they were waiting to see how this empty commander would conjure up a cavalry to teach them a lesson. Brando never spoke nonsense. He turned his horse around and unsheathed Howran Gaya. He proudly shouted, "Who is willing to be the vanguard, come to my side." There was silence. Only Freya was the first to step forward. She held her sword with one hand, her knuckles turning white. For a moment, she felt as if she had returned to the night when she escaped from Fortress Reeden. It was almost the same situation and they fought side by side. It was a miracle that only he could create. Two people. Breton hesitated for a moment, then also stepped forward. Brando, what the hell are you doing? He could not help but ask in a low voice. Brando glanced at him but did not answer. The sound of a horse's neigh seemed to come from the heavens, and the rain continued to fall. Blazing white dots of light appeared from the darkness and gathered little by little. Amidst the white light, Medusa held a spear in one hand, and slowly walked out of the void to Brendel's side. Next was Scarlet, a red-haired girl holding a halberd. Although it was no longer the spear of lightning, it could not hide her aura. Another gold ranker under the age of 20. The princess and her teacher silently looked at each other. The Shire smiled. As a mage's attendant, he naturally had to stand together with his knight. He lightly patted his horse, and the horse seemed to understand him and docilely came to Brando's side. Next was Mephistopheles and Andrique. The vampire's daughter stood out from the rest. She wore a long cloak, and in her hands was no longer the pair of blood-sculpted scimitars she usually used. Instead, it was a spear that surged with the power of blood. The two of them stood side by side. Next was the mercenaries of Lopez. When the Nightsong Tiger and the others appeared, they caused quite a stir. The mercenaries of Lopez's reputation was not only in Brando's memory, but also in the whole continent. Their attire was so strange that they attracted everyone's attention. This is impossible. He has the mercenaries of Lopez under his command. Legend has it that the mercenaries of Lopez never leave Fanzan to fight. What is this guy's background? 1 elemental awakener, 5 gold rankers and more than 10 silver rankers. Although the number of people did not exceed 30, when these people gathered around Brando, everyone gasped. This was an army. Not to mention the others, even Princess Griffin could not help but be startled. Although I have heard of it, I still did not expect him to have so many talented people under his command. She could not help but sigh in a low voice. But he still stands with you, Your Highness. Oberway replied. That is because of his knight's qualities. The princess sighed. But I, the royal family of Corvado, do I deserve such honor? Oberway did not answer. That's a silver elf. A scream came from the crowd. Medusa had silver hair, silver eyes and skin as white as snow. Most importantly, the dazzling scale armor on her body was like a work of art. It was exactly like the armor of the legendary Silver Elves. The Silver Elves are back. Are my eyes playing tricks on me? Everyone was stunned. Legend has it that the Silver Elves went into seclusion after a prophecy. They claimed that until the day the 4 holy cathedrals fulfilled the Holy Covenant, they would fight alongside the Black Elves again. But the Holy War was imminent, and the day when the 4 holy cathedrals fulfilled the Holy Covenant seemed to be far away. Only Oberway could see that Medusa was different. It's a heroic spirit. The princess nodded gently. His knight had gathered around him. No one could laugh anymore. The strength of Brando's side was enough to make him a king. Everyone understood this. He raised the long sword in his hand, Haurangaya, and the black blade vibrated slightly as it pierced through the rain. Listen carefully. Don't let me see anyone fall behind. Or else I'm afraid you will fail. The sword fell and the sound of horse hooves thundered. P.S. I went out today and I got home in the afternoon, so I'm a little late. This should be the last chapter of the Book of Wrath. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 579. The ripples created by a single drop of water could spread across the entire pond like a spider web. It was the same on land. Rodu watched with satisfaction as his private soldiers spread out in the rain along the Silversmith River. Although their movements were slow, their formation was messy, and the nobles' private soldiers were shouting and pushing each other in the rain, they were able to set up a line of defense a quarter of an hour faster than he had expected. Veterans who have been on the battlefield are indeed different, the Baron thought as he sat on horseback, completely ignoring the fact that their previous opponents were just unarmed peasants and so-called thugs. Under the heavy rain, a few soldiers under the lead of a knight kicked open the door of a house and chased the owner out. They then occupied the house as their base of operations. The windows of the house were broken one by one, and the soldiers were rummaging through the cabinets in search of valuable spoils of war. Their actions were quickly copied by the others, and for a moment, the cries of women and children filled the air. Baron Rodu watched coldly from the side. In his eyes, an army was like a beast, and a beast had to bare its fangs and bare its claws. This was the morale of an army, and without morale, how could they fight a war? Rodu thought that he was an experienced soldier, and when he saw his private soldiers using their fists to teach those dejected men a lesson, not only did he not stop them, he even felt satisfied. How could these thugs have the courage to resist? They had to be taught a lesson so that they would obey obediently. The sound of crying could be heard in the rain. The knight gathered around the baron and said loudly, "I think the princess is just a little girl who blindly trusts the people around her. I think the royal faction is also up to no good, giving her 200 students. I'm afraid she's going to have a hard time." "Yes, my lord, this time will show her what a real war is like." The knight echoed in unison, laughing in the rain. Seeing the morale of the soldiers working, Rodu nodded in satisfaction. He raised a bag high and shouted, "Everyone work harder. Whoever captures the princess will be able to take this bag of gold from my hands." His voice spread far and wide along the riverbank. Bess looked disdainfully at the enemy on the other side of the river through the brass spyglass. She frowned at Rodu's duck-like voice. Ever since she was young, she had always been like a man. When she grew up, Bess really picked up the romantic side of a man and became a soldier of the kingdom. Not only that, she also became the most outstanding scout officer of the Royal Knight Academy. She put down her binoculars and stood as straight as a javelin on the horse. The thundering hooves seemed to want to merge with her. One after another, the horses and the knight leaped past her. Bess felt like she was in the middle of a torrent, and her companions were calling out the names of the knights. "Ken Mare. Iman. Keel, remember to bring my share. Eden for Erwin. For Erwin, advance." Every young knight who passed by was shouting and shrieking. There was not a trace of fear on the young faces under the pointed helmets. There was only an indomitable yearning to move forward. An excitement. Bess silently looked at the front of the line. It was already a torrent. At the furthest end of the curtain of rain, swallowtail flags had been lowered one by one, like dominoes. She could almost hear the cold command, "Level the pike! Level the pike!" "How unlucky," she spat. She looked back, only to see the smiling face of her companion. "What, do you regret it, Bess?" "Regret? Of course not." Bess replied contemptuously, "They're just chickens and dogs. If only it was the White Lion Legion in front. We're stronger than them." "The princess's safety is more important, Bess. Your thoughts are too dangerous." "Of course I know." In the heavy rain, Rodu raised his money bag high, waiting for his subordinates to cheer. Unfortunately, he did not get a response for a long time. The silence in the heavy rain was a little strange. "What's wrong?" He looked back in shock. Everyone was listening attentively. On the long street, the crisp sound of hooves could be heard amidst the rain. 1, 2, as if the hour hand was spinning faster, the sound was clear and powerful. Then, a storm, the hooves of the horses were lifted up and down by hundreds of thousands. They were uniform and gradually gathered into a force that shook people's hearts. A rapid drumbeat penetrated everyone's eardrums. It was as loud as thunder. The Silversmith River was just a small ditch in the city of Ampere Seal. A rainstorm would cause it to overflow over the low and flat embankment. At this moment, everyone was looking at the water. The surface of the water trembled as if it was milk in a cup on the table. The surface of the Silversmith River trembled slightly. Until a pike cut through the curtain of rain. The shining tip of the pike was like a silver shuttle, and all the raindrops flew out from both sides of it. A man and a horse, their silver hair flying, their snow-white cloaks like flags, painted with pure lilies, as if they were still shining on the battlefield 1,000 years ago. On the other side of the river, the noble's private soldier who was holding a family captive had this thought in his mind. He was even completely stunned, and could only open his mouth wide as he watched the tip of the pike in his field of vision grow bigger and bigger. In an instant, as if time had frozen, it suddenly resumed its flow. With a squelch, the pike directly pierced through the soldier's open mouth and into his brain. The tip of the pike pierced through his throat, and then the huge impact completely shattered his skull, causing his facial features to distort. The fear in his eyes also distorted together, and after showing the greatest tension, his skin tore apart with a whoosh, revealing the bright red flesh and blood below. Blood spurted out, but the pike continued to move forward, lifting half of the skull, and continued forward with the bright red flag. The soldier who lost half of his head twitched and then fell to the ground softly. Blood splattered in the wind and rain, and a few sprayed on the captives at the side. The family of 3 was completely stunned where they were. Medisha swept past them with a cold face. Like a silver light. A few drops of blood fell on the face of the silver elf princess, and it was a little cold and piercing, but she did not even blink. According to the age of humans, she was only 15 years old this year, but she had experienced thousands of wars long ago. It was the most tragic war since the year of the Holy Saints, and countless familiar people died in it. Life and death became passers-by, and only fighting became instinct. This was the battle skill of the Silver Elves. Enemy attack. It's the cavalry. The shrill cry was like a sharp, ear-piercing alarm that resounded through the river bank. Everyone seemed to wake up from a dream, and it seemed that the enemy was not as weak as they imagined. Baron Rodu's face was pale, and he suddenly had a bad premonition in his heart. He looked back, and the knight looked at each other. When had they ever seen such a rider? Medisha raised her pike high. In the wind and rain, the flag fluttered. There was a loud bang as if a barrier was broken behind her. The curtain of rain in front of everyone shattered like a glass wall, and the rainwater turned into pieces of glass and suddenly moved forward. After that, a huge army of knights seemed to break out of a box. Black military uniforms, black armor, black war horses, a black torrent. Long live! Long live! The knights shouted, and the real warriors were not stingy with their blood. Although Medisha was just a little girl, she temporarily had the demeanor of a real knight, and at this moment she became a goddess in everyone's heart. The goddess of war. Stop them. On the other side of the river, a noble knight finally reacted, and almost shouted himself hoarse, set up your pikes, or you're dead. The noble's private soldiers on the other side of the river seemed to have just come to life, and only then did they hurriedly set up their pikes. Perhaps it was their survival instinct that stimulated their last bit of potential, or perhaps it was the shallow Silversmith River that comforted them, but no matter what, at the last moment, these insignificant third-rate soldiers actually calmed down. A forest of pikes appeared on the other side of the river. Medisha ignored it and only raised her pike. Wings of Spirit. A clear shout resounded throughout the battlefield. A circle of magic circle unfolded on both sides of the girl, and as the magic circle spun, the spiritual lines expanded along the circle, and quickly connected into one. Asterisk whoosh asterisk a pair of wings that were hundreds of feet long spread out, and with a gentle flap of the wings, the Silversmith River in front of Medisha seemed to be injected with some kind of magic, and the white waves in the river immediately rolled back, and the waves formed a 12-headed hydra that raised its head high, and like a tsunami, it pressed down on Baron Rodu's private soldiers on the other side of the river. Ah! Baron Rodu was stunned, and for a moment he did not even know if he should give the order to defend or retreat. He had some mediocre wizards under his command, but at this level their usefulness was meaningless. The noble's private soldiers could only watch as the giant wave came crashing down on them. Asterisk boom. Asterisk the giant wave instantly broke the formation of the noble's private soldiers on the other side of the river. In fact, before the giant wave formed, they had already begun to waver, but how could they move faster than the wave? Most of the noble's private soldiers had just turned around when they were swept into the river like garbage. Then, the flood brought the screaming noble's private soldiers head-on into the houses on the other side of the Silversmith River. After a few loud creaking sounds, the houses collapsed and flowed into the streets behind them. Baron Rodu's line of defense collapsed in an instant. Behind the giant wave, the young knight walked on the waves. They were facing a line of defense that was constantly retreating, and the pikemen had already fallen forward and backward, unable to fight back. One side was retreating while the other side was accelerating, and then the two lines of defense crashed into each other. It was like the scene of a comb combing one's hair. The young knights of the princess penetrated the formation of the noble's private soldiers almost without any hindrance, leaving behind a line of defense that was riddled with holes like a sieve. However, wave after wave of attacks, the psychological defense of the noble's private soldiers completely collapsed in an instant. They could only turn around and run. But the merciless cavalry continued to advance. The young cadets were driving the enemy away to prevent them from regrouping. Even though it was meaningless against the private soldiers of the nobles, the young cadets still followed the strict rules of the cavalry as if they were textbook standards. As far as the eye could see, Luodu's private soldiers were fleeing in all directions like ants under a collapsing dam. The sky was slowly turning bright. Brando pursed his lips as he looked at the scene in front of him, but there was no trace of satisfaction on his face. He suddenly tightened his grip on the reins of his horse, and both man and horse turned around. After standing still, he raised Haurangaya high up and pointed it to the side. Breton, blow the horn. Have the entire army split up. Brando, what are you trying to do? Breton almost jumped up. Wasn't this the time to chase away the enemy? but he immediately became speechless. He stared blankly at the sky-blue spiders that appeared once again. But this time they were not on the ground but in the sky behind Brando. One by one, tens of thousands of wind spirit spiders appeared in the sky above the battlefield, like a dense, sky-blue net. There was a moment of silence on the battlefield. Brando turned around. Brando, you. Breton swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Freya was also stunned. It was not the first time she saw these spiders, but it was the first time she saw Brando commanding so many spiders. Listen to my orders. Brando's voice suddenly echoed throughout the battlefield. Knights of the Royal Knight Academy, continue to attack from the flanks and continue to advance. Advance! Advance! After a moment of silence, there was a tsunami of cheers and roars. After Baron Rodu was dragged out of the water, he stared blankly at his knight. That knight was shouting at him, but strangely he could not hear a single word. But finally the sound seemed to have returned to his senses. He gradually heard his subordinate shouting something to him. My lord, they are splitting up. What's splitting up? Those knights are splitting up. Rodu was startled, but his face lost its last trace of color. Those bastards are herding us together. They intend to drive us forward. They intend to use us as cannon fodder, my lord. My lord, the coast guards behind us have been discovered by them. The mournful cries seemed to be far away in Baron Rodu's ears. He stood up shakily and stammered, We can't let this happen. Ian, help me get on the horse. We have to think of a way to regroup or we will die. But he could not finish his sentence. He suddenly saw a spear protruding from the chest of his subordinate knight. He looked up and saw the red-haired female knight riding on the warhorse, her long ponytail fluttering in the wind. That was the last thing Baron Rodu saw. Then everything fell into a cold darkness. Scarlet wiped the blood off her cheeks and turned back. Her cold amber eyes only showed a little warmth when she saw that figure. On the battlefield at the same time, almost the exact same scene was playing out in many places. Rodu's knights obviously understood their final fate, but there were still some who tried to resist. But just as these knights were about to gather the people around them, a dazzling golden light fell from the sky. In an instant it pierced through his body. On the battlefield the golden light crisscrossed. Rodu is finished. They have discovered the army of Sir Owen and Sir Malloser. Our princess is not simple. The white-haired but still hale and hearty old man turned around with a smile. He was wearing the most traditional military uniform of Erewhon, with a variety of medals hanging on his chest, and the most dazzling one was the candlelight medal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Leiter Dullo, deputy commander of the White Lion Legion, and also the most senior knight in the White Lion Legion. In the eyes of crews he was Erewhon's most respected enemy, and the true pillar of the White Lion Legion, the Lion of Erewhon. When he became famous, Sly Fox and Lone Wolf were still children. He was loyal to the royal family of Covardo, neither the royal family nor the northern nobles. He was a mainstay of the royal family's power. But in this civil war, in order to repay the kindness of the royal family's eldest son, he stood on the side of the northern nobles without hesitation. Even so, no one dared to disrespect him, not even the players back then. This old man became famous in the Holy War, and since then he had been the spiritual pillar of Erewhon's army. His loyalty to the kingdom was no less than anyone else's. But at this moment the old man shook his head and looked at the other two people in the room. He smiled and said, It's embarrassing that we old men have to bully a little girl. Marquis Balta smiled awkwardly. He certainly knew what the old man meant. Don't worry, Knight Leiter, we will ensure the safety of the princess and the little prince. Although he was the commander of the legion, he couldn't be tough in front of this old man. The old man glanced at him. But I'm more concerned about how they discovered the coast guards. Marquis Balta quickly changed the subject. I'm not sure, but their scouts shouldn't have been able to get here. Although Rodu is an idiot, he has hundreds of men blocking the Silversmith River. It's not like he can't even keep an eye on a living person. The old knight touched his chin. The other party should have made a judgment. It's not impossible to find them through clues. Her Royal Highness has grown amazingly under the guidance of that little wolf. In all of Erewhon, probably only this old knight dared to call Oberway a little wolf. Balta couldn't help but smile bitterly. The royal family's eldest son is not inferior under the guidance of the old man. This time the old knight nodded without hesitation. While the two were talking, the guest beside them who hadn't spoken all this time suddenly stood up. Hey, what's that? This is the heaven's armor. In the wind and rain, in the direction of the Silversmith River, golden light was intertwined. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 580. The collapse of Baron Rodu's army was accelerating. The students of the Royal Knight Academy were driving hundreds of defeated soldiers forward. The 7th Swordsman Brigade of the Coast Guards at the front line of the Evergreen Square was the first to bear the pressure. The terrified nobles' private soldiers had no choice but to pass through their positions, as if they were grasping at straws for survival. The Coast Guards even had a fierce confrontation with the fleeing soldiers. Ironically, when the fleeing nobles' private soldiers turned around and faced their original allies, they were 10 times more ferocious. Their survival instinct turned them into red-eyed fanatics. Behind them were the gleaming spears that were driving them forward. This was a little different from what Sir Marloser, the captain of the 7th Swordsman Brigade of the Coast Guards of Ampere Seal, had expected. Not only did the princess and her men appear, but they also barged in. But this collision was a little too decisive and fierce. Not only did they destroy Rodu's army, but they also seemed to have seen through their position at a glance. The princess' aggressive approach was in direct proportion to Marloser's increasingly pale face. But what should he do now? The knight, who had almost never really killed an enemy in his life, looked back at his companion. In the heavy rain, the young man in the armor of the White Lion Legion held his sword in his hand and was silent. He was like a marble statue, allowing the water droplets to slide down his forehead and cheeks. He was completely undecided. We've been discovered. How did they discover us? Maybe now is not the time to think about this. He looked up, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the cold light of the rows of spears, flashing with the light of reason. In that case, let's change the game. Above the clouds, lightning was zigzagging out a dazzling trajectory. Balta, you have a good student. When Leiter Dullo received the order from the messenger, his eyes showed a hint of approval as he spoke lightly. Marquis Balta shook his head. Her Royal Highness is not weak at all. This doesn't seem to be the work of Oberway. Even Makarov isn't that decisive. The enemy seems to have a commander that we're unfamiliar with. The Coast Guard's combat power is really worrying. It seems like Owen wants to use the advantage of numbers to stall the enemy. Just like what we did in Lonch. The old man looked in the direction of the port. In his vision there was a gray roof. It's like a huge meat grinder. Slowly the last drop of Erwin's blood flows. Mr. Archbishop, these words are not directed at you. Leiter glanced at the guest beside him again and replied faintly. That person smiled faintly and didn't seem to mind. We were also wrong about the decisions we made in the past. There's nothing to avoid. The Holy War is imminent, and the Temple does not wish for new misunderstandings to arise because of past misunderstandings. The old man glanced at him, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with him. Old commander. Balta was a little restless. You're the regimental commander now, Balta, the old man replied. Don't worry, I won't blame Owen for this. Victory or defeat is always the most important thing in a war. He has a very good plan. Using numbers to bully others is also a skill. But, I'm afraid Her Royal Highness is going to suffer this time. On this battlefield, it's the blood of Erwin's people that flows. Aren't they also a bunch of excellent young men? What a pity. The old man shook his head. The sky was gradually brightening. But the battle situation was not like that. The news sent back from the front clearly told Brando that the Coast Guards were changing their strategy. But changing their minds at the last minute was not a good way to play, especially when their intentions were so obvious. Brando couldn't help but sneer. The Coast Guard's generals had decided to engage in street warfare with him. Haha, he almost laughed out loud to express the joy in his heart. The attack and defense of Kirko, the attack and defense of Braggs, the capture of Ampere Seal, the pain of Sioux, the blood of White City. There was no need to deliberately recall them. One by one, classic battles appeared in his mind. But more importantly, he had personally participated in them. He had fought against Cruz's people, against Madara's people, against All for One, and even against the Myernas who lived in the dark, and not the third-rate Coast Guards of Ampere Seal. He turned around, and who were the people beside him? Loka Vanden Elvis, Enrique Aisha, Freya Alicia, the 3 famous heroes of Erwin's history. 2 of them were masters of cavalry tactics, and 1 was the Valkyrie of Erwin. In addition, there was Breton of Bucci, a strong man who led a group of knights to fight a bloody path out from the hands of the one-eyed dragon Tarkus, and the captain of the Royal Knight Regiment, Mach. The most famous young generals of Erwin's future surrounded him. They had truly changed an era and pulled Erwin out of the darkest abyss of history. Although it was only for a short period of time, they were all heroes of their time. Although Erwin was defeated, it was not because of the battle. This time the other party was really digging their own graves. Perhaps the generals on the other side would never have thought that in the next century on the continent of Wond, because of the participation of players, the war would change at a rapid rate. It was a dark and war-torn era, but it was also a magnificent era supported by geniuses and crazy ideals. But what was always right now might not necessarily be true in the future. Loka, Enrique, Freya, Breton, Mock, the other party wants to use street warfare to delay us. Brando looked at the battlefield in front of him and smiled gently. They want to turn this place into a meat grinder. Did you all doze off during the tactical class? Mock stared at him coldly. The other party's previous orders did not seem wrong, but it was not a big deal. At most, it was just following the rules. If it were them, they might have been able to do better. Breton did not answer. The Brando in front of him had changed too much. In fact, since the escape from Butchie, the other party had been transforming. Although he did not want to admit it, he had to admit that the young man in front of him was no longer the miller's son that he looked down on. Although the grudge between the two of them had been resolved, it did not mean that he would stand on the other party's side. Among the four of them, only Loka van den Elvis smiled slightly and did not seem to care. This young man was wearing the black military uniform of the Royal Knights Academy. He had light blonde hair and tied it into a ponytail. He looked a little shy and did not completely break away from the impression that the Royal Knights Academy had left on them. He was a little immature, but he already had the calm temperament of a general. In fact, in history he had always been the leader of the three heroes. Loka van den Elvis was the eldest son of the family. His father was an unknown noble in the Viro province. In history the family had never produced any great figures, but Loka was undoubtedly an exception. In history, Loka van den Elvis had single-handedly toyed with Cypher's army in the palm of his hand. Due to his gentle personality he was known as the Sheathed Sword. It meant that once he revealed his ability, he would be unstoppable and invincible. It was a pity that before this sheathed sword could be unsheathed, he died in the war in the north. He did not even have the time to participate in the Second War of the Black Roses. This was one of Erwin's biggest regrets. Of course, this time, Brando would definitely not let this regret happen again. The reason why he gathered these young people around him was that he was afraid that they would die in an accident in the war in Ampere-Seal. For example, Enrique of the three of them had died in the end. However, without experience, it was impossible to forge a sharp sword. Brando knew this, but he could only do his best to prevent it. My lord, this is not going to be easy. The Coast Guards are more powerful than us, and they have the geographical advantage. If they are determined to fight us in the streets, I'm afraid it will be difficult for us to deal with them. Enrique was riding on a horse, his black hair shining as he replied with a smile. This guy now looked a little like Carglass, completely different from his quiet personality in the future. He had a good relationship with Loka and they used to call each other brother. It must be the double blow of the decline of the kingdom and Loka's death that changed him. Brando thought sympathetically. That's not necessarily true. He smiled. Did you forget that I was invited by Her Highness to give you a lesson today? Actually, it's very easy to defeat the Coast Guards like how we defeated Rodu. Bullsh *T. Mauka made a direct conclusion. That's not necessarily true. Brando laughed. Moke, why don't we make a bet? If I can really do it, why don't you do something for me? The gray-haired young man glanced at him. What is it? Come and be my servant, how about that? Brando snickered in his heart. The future leader of the Iron Mask Knight would be his servant. He still remembered how this guy caused trouble for the players in the past. It had to be said that Brando was still a narrow-minded guy. Of course, as for failure? What a joke, that was something he had never considered. Moke was silent for a while. Of course, he knew that the other party would not make such a bet for no reason. However, the young were fearless. He finally nodded. What if you lose? I'll be your adjutant. Moke. Freya could not help but remind him. She was probably the only one who knew Brando the best. However, the gray-haired young man only glanced at her and replied, Don't worry, Freya. I won't embarrass him too much. I'm just afraid that you'll be embarrassed. The future goddess of war was speechless. Very well, the contract is established. Brando smiled. You guys come over here. I'll tell you how to fight this battle. In fact, Freya's worries soon became reality. Brando began to issue orders. The next moment, the cavalry of the Wangli Knight Academy began to advance in the direction his sword was pointing. From a bird's eye view, it looked like a huge arrow had split into countless tentacles. The cavalry was attacking together, moving as fast as lightning along the streets of various sizes. Almost in an instant. In the darkness, the expressions of the generals of the White Lion Legion, who were closely watching everything that happened on the huge battlefield, changed. Countless scouts were shuttling back and forth between the front lines and the rear. After a lot of ambiguous information was gathered, a clear picture appeared in front of everyone. The command center of the White Lion Legion fell into a panic. How are they working together? They're crazy. Martha above, this is impossible. Everyone was completely dumbfounded. In the direction of the Evergreen Square. In fact, in front of the square was a densely packed area of shops. At this moment, Baron Rodu's defeated soldiers were attacking their allies' positions from all directions through these alleys. Behind them, the Young Knight Academy meticulously executed their tactics. The Young Knight formed small teams to drive away the defeated soldiers. On the other hand, the Young Knights split up and formed tactical teams to outflank the Coast Guard's positions. In just 10 minutes, the junior officers of the Coast Guards had experienced a long and unbearable nightmare. This was beyond the common sense they had learned on all occasions. The enemy could appear at any time in any direction, wherever they wanted to, and attack their positions. They had built a standard line of defense according to the drill provided by the White Lion Legion sergeants. In the face of such an attack, they were almost vulnerable. In front of this position, the attacks of the princess side seemed to have turned into real, flowing water. When the whole army moved, mercury would flow to the ground. The situation had completely changed. How are they maintaining the command system? Image crystal. Impossible. On such a huge battlefield, any magic communication will interfere with each other. Listen carefully. Even the wizards of Buga can't do this. Forster, the head of the White Lion Legion's 1st Guard Regiment, roared at his adjutant. His adjutant's face was pale and could only obey. But perhaps it was his adjutant's bitter smile that made Forster realize that his anger would not change the current situation. He could not help but raise his head stiffly. He stared blankly at the huge map hanging in the middle of the tent. On the map, the bright red line depicted the Coast Guard's line of defense seemed so heavy, clumsy, and full of holes. It was like a silent mockery to the entire White Lion Legion. But this was an absolutely standard line of defense. Even Cruz, the powerful Empire's infantry drill book, could not find a more perfect example of this line of defense. It was heavy and clumsy, but at the same time, it was also stable and could not be bypassed. It was invulnerable. Every point of its defense was so precise, as if it had been tempered thousands of times and modified by generations of people. He was like a slow-moving giant. There were only two outcomes when facing him: let him bleed to the last drop of blood, or let him bleed to the last drop of his own blood. It was like a perfect meat grinder. It was filled with his own life, but also the enemy's life. There was no other way but to break through directly. The White Lion Legion, Owen and Maloise had carefully arranged this bloody battlefield, ready to let Her Highness bleed to the last drop of her blood. But just as they were about to throw a heavy punch, they found that their enemy had turned into a pile of loose sand in front of them, and then drilled into their bodies. In an instant, the giant's huge body became his own greatest enemy. The stable line of defense seemed to have fallen into a precarious state in the blink of an eye, but no one knew what had happened. They would never understand how the students of the Royal Knight Academy turned the army into a pile of loose sand. In all common sense, it was a sign of an army's collapse, a sign of suicide. Even Baron Rodu had explained it perfectly 15 minutes ago. But in the blink of an eye, the enemy's black cavalry had completely obliterated this common sense. They did not understand. It was as if they did not understand the earth-shattering and profound changes that the radio in the other world had brought to the battlefield after World War I. Brando was using another method to make the same change. This was not his credit. The players had more ingenious methods than him to achieve all of this. But for Brando this was enough. The wind and rain intertwined. The blond young man raised his hand and looked at the wind spirit spider in his hand. He tied a piece of paper on it, and the elf-like creature disappeared in the wind and rain. He looked back and silently looked in the direction of that person, his heart burning with passion. No one knew better than him that this war in Ampere Seal was destined to change things. This battle lasted less than a quarter of an hour from start to finish. It was destined to be recorded in history. When Forster looked away from the map, he finally realized that he might have made a mistake. He looked at his subordinates, the young men of the White Lion Legion, who still had a look of disbelief on their faces. "My lord, how did they do it?" Some of them even asked. "That's not the point," Forster interrupted them disappointedly. He hoped that the White Lion Legion would be calmer and sharper in the future. "The point now is that the Coast Guards are destined to be defeated. It won't be long before they follow in Rodu's footsteps." The young men were stunned for a moment, then their eyes lit up. Well, it seems that you all understand, Forster nodded. According to the plan, it's time for the kingdom's lions to bare their fangs. Everyone was solemn. Send an order to Owen. Tell him to return to his position. Franz, I want to see you and your knight appear in the predetermined positions at the scheduled time. Khan, put on your cloak. You're ready to go. The Empire's lion, unstoppable. All the knights shouted in unison. Everyone stood at attention, and then with a solemn expression, they saluted this Sir Commander before turning around and leaving. A young man walked past them. Captain, an army is passing through the Longjing market and approaching the Coast Guard's flank. There was silence in the tent. Forster was slightly stunned. He looked back at the huge map. That's the area Cullen is in charge of. What flag are they using? The young man was a little embarrassed and did not answer. Answer my question, soldier, Forster said sternly. It's the White Lion battle flag. My lord. Forster was slightly stunned. Which division's White Lion battle flag is it? He hurriedly asked, almost angrily, who acted on their own without my orders? What is it? It's the White Lion Legion, the Praetorian Legion, the young man stammered. Praetorian Legion? Forster was stunned. Did the White Lion Legion have such a designation? There seemed to be. It was the designation of the infantry knight that followed the late King Eric everywhere. But after the late King Eric passed away, this designation was left vacant forever. It was to pay tribute to Erwin's lion. Forster's expression changed. P.S. I've been thinking about it for a while. I've been trying to find the feeling in the afternoon. Boo-hoo, I've listened to countless songs. Oh yes, from now on, I'll prepare some manuscripts for release at the end of the month. Remember to leave your votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 581. The sword was inserted into the meadow between the wilderness and the sky. The blade was as bright as autumn water. The white ribbon with the crescent moon emblem wrapped around the hilt of the sword was twirling in the wind, swaying slightly as if it was in his memory. His wise and deep eyes squinted slightly as he looked with interest at the wide almond-shaped field of vision between heaven and earth. A white cloak covered his body, and under the cloak, a pair of rough hands held a black scabbard. He stood upright like a majestic lion. My king, it's late. The old man smiled and turned back to ask calmly, Krentel, guess what I'm looking at? Beyond this grassland, forward and forward to the land of Erwin. Erwin, that's the land that we will protect with our lives. But I'm looking at my sword, Krentel. The old man retracted his gaze. The sword looked unique and slender in the wilderness, but it was able to support the world. Your sword? I'm thinking thousands of years later, will anyone still pick up this sword, wipe away the dust on it, and remember our oath? Will our descendants be able to withstand the test of time? Do you think Erwin will exist for a long time? Erwin will exist for a long time, Your Majesty. But time flies. What if one day our descendants forget the promise we made today? The people of Cruz also had the glory of their ancestors, but they have long stopped picking up everything. Maybe one day the people of Erwin will do the same. Your Majesty. I don't want Erwin, Krentel. The old man's grayish-blue eyes reflected the shadows of the clouds, and his soft gray hair stuck to the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Time had left too heavy a mark on him. The old man felt that the flame in his heart was burning to its end, but at this moment, it seemed to be glowing again. He had seen too many wars, too many sufferings, and too many people who were close to him sacrificed on this land. He closed his eyes, and the scenes of the past were like a golden scroll. It was as if they had left Cruz's land for the first time at dusk under the setting sun. That was where it all began. What I want is not Erwin and Krentel, but the soul and belief of this land. I want this voice to be passed on forever. I want the resistance and pursuit of Erwin to never be forgotten. I want its nobles to always remember their duty, Krentel. Remember, if one day the people of Erwin really forget all of this, then this sword will return to where it came from, and it will no longer protect this country. In that case, the sword would return to where it came from. Your Majesty, Erwin has really forgotten everything. It's only been 200 years. This land will no longer bear the burden of that perfect ideal, but today the sword had returned. The sword in Krentel's eyes was emitting endless golden light. It was trembling in the girl's hand as if it had been reborn. It was trembling excitedly and could break out of the box at any moment. Krentel suddenly felt that his tears were gushing out uncontrollably, although he had stopped crying a long time ago. but those were the tears in his heart. "Your Majesty, do you see? Someone picked up this sword, wiped away the dust on it, and remembered our oath." Therefore he felt that belief again. After being forgotten for centuries, the glorious flag returned to Erewhon. Brando also looked at the Leo sword in Freya's hand. At that moment he heard the sound of the sword, like a landslide or a tsunami, as if a huge voice was reverberating and narrating. He seemed to see the glorious era and the two elongated figures in the lonely wilderness. The sword was fulfilling the oath. Would Erewhon exist for a long time? "Erewhon will exist for a long time, Your Majesty." "What happened, Freya?" Maynard asked loudly. Everyone was stunned by the intense light that suddenly emitted from Freya's sword. I don't know." Freya stared at the trembling sword in her hand, dumbfounded. It seemed to have come alive and was responding to something. It seems to have felt something. The whole of Ampere Seal shook. Forster rushed out of the tent like a madman. The entire command post of the White Lion Legion was shrouded in a loud buzzing sound. In the camp, everyone involuntarily stopped and raised their heads to look in one direction. Right in the middle of the camp, the huge White Lion war flag was emitting an incomparably dazzling light. The war flag stood tall in the wind and rain. The white lion on the flag seemed to have come alive at this moment, baring its fangs and claws. The glorious flag. Forster was suddenly stunned. He seemed to have understood something and looked towards the west in a daze. Knight Captain Cullen of the 4th Column of the White Lion Legion was also looking in the same direction. In the wind and rain, an army he had never seen before was slowly passing through the curtain of rain and arriving in front of him. There seemed to be singing in the rain. "I swear an oath before this sword. I swear to lead my people away from slaughter and strife, away from the arrogance and greed of the nobles. I swear to not repeat this cold-blooded mistake. I will make the nobles of the new kingdom follow the spirit of the knight, fair and strict, upright and brave, benevolent and generous. I swear that I will do so today, and every day will be the same." Silver elven helmets bathed in the rain. The white lion on their shoulders seemed to have walked out of the legends. The sword in their hands was 5 feet long and as wide as a palm. There was the mark of a lion's heart on the hilt. They wore heavy armor and a scaled skirt. At this moment the legend and reality overlapped. The army that slowly walked out of the rain hit the softest part of the hearts of the White Lion Legion in an instant. It was as if they had walked out of a brilliant historical story, and even had the mysterious and magical aura of a fairy tale. The army that only existed in legends had appeared in front of them. It was their predecessors, their history, their pride. The White Lion Legion's Praetorian Legion. But now it was their enemy. Therefore they had violated their oath. The glory they claimed to have inherited from King Eric was about to be washed away. The legendary army was about to remove the laurels from their heads. Everyone could not help but take a step back subconsciously. It was the legend they had heard countless times from the stories that had accompanied them as they grew up. It was the legend that had strengthened their beliefs. Although the White Lion Legion walked silently in the rain, it was only half a platoon. All of the soldiers in the White Lion Legion were veterans. They could calculate the number of people in the enemy with just a glance. 45. But so what? Knight Cullen felt his palms sweating. Ever since he became a knight, he had never lost the courage to hold his sword before facing his opponent. But the honor of a soldier did not allow him to abandon his sword and surrender. Moreover, the fear was only a momentary illusion. Cullen reacted instantly. He gritted his teeth and shouted, "What a disgrace! Where did this clown come from? How dare he disguise himself as the White Lion Legion?" His voice spread far and wide in the rain. The White Lion Legion? The army stopped and the commander was clearly taken aback. Now was the time. Grabbing the fleeting opportunity, Cullen raised his sword. "White Lion Legion, 4th Column, listen to my command. Destroy these fanatics who blaspheme King Eric." The soldiers of the White Lion Legion roared in unison. It was as if this was the only thing that could dispel the doubts in their hearts. Just like how their ancestors and comrades had charged at Cruz's cavalry on the highlands, for the first time in thousands of years, they charged at Erewhon's people. The horn of the White Lion Legion echoed for a long time. The melodious sound contained the long and glorious history of this legendary army. Every time they charged forward, they had never met a worthy opponent. It was not because they were invincible but because they were indomitable. In front of the White Lion Legion, no enemy could make them tremble in fear. Because this was the courage of a lion. This was the belief that King Eric had given them. The soldiers unsheathed their swords. There were only 200 of them, but they carried the aura of 1,000 men. The White Lion Legion's flag advanced in the rain. Their formation was as tight as a sharp blade, sweeping across the battlefield. However, it was not only discipline that maintained this sharp blade but also faith. For the first time today the hand holding the sword felt sluggish. It really is the White Lion Legion. Karglai suddenly felt that this was an illusion of fate. It was as if an invisible hand had arranged for them to meet, and this meeting was eternal. However, he also understood what it meant to have an unexpected enemy formation on the battlefield. There's a change in the situation. The young commander decided to meet up with the Lord immediately. But before that, they were blocked by another army called the White Lion Legion. He unsheathed his sword. Cullen gripped his sword tightly as well. Listen to my command. White Lion Legion. In the pouring rain, 2 orders were shouted at the same time. Karglai had expected this, but Cullen felt as if he had been shot by a sharp arrow. In front of him, the strange yet familiar army suddenly sped up. Although their heavy armor dragged the ground and their swords accompanied them, it was as if every one of them had the terrifying aura of a galloping horse. The ground trembled, and the green slabs on the long street were slightly tilted up. Infantry Knight. Cullen's palms turned white. This was the legendary Infantry Knight. The White Lion Legion's armor was surrounded by a green wind. The White Lion Legion had lost this forging technique after the Battle of Lune. This was the core technique of the half-plate Wind Empress, a secret technique that allowed heavy armor to be as light as a light armor. They were all magic armors. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion felt oppressed. Since the end of the Holy War, or 2 centuries, Erwin had never had an army like this. But the key was the indomitable aura of the 2 legions. If there was anything different, it was that the other party seemed to have a kind of perseverance that they did not have. They could see the pride and glory of being a soldier, but there was something in the other party's sparkling eyes under the mask that they had never seen before. Perseverance and pursuit. The 2 armies were only a hair's breadth apart. The veterans of the White Lion Legion were fearless. They even felt a little ashamed. It was not the glory of the White Lion Legion to fight with numbers. But this did not stop them from raising their swords. Their hearts were filled with determination. The experience they had gained from hundreds and thousands of battles allowed them to deal with all kinds of unexpected situations coldly and calmly. But an accident really did happen. There were still 10 meters to go. The heavily armored White Lion Legion raised their 2-handed swords. The swords were 5 feet long and as wide as a palm. There was a lion's heart mark on the hilt and 3 claw marks on the blade. It was the legendary sword of the lion. But Cullen saw that the swords in the hands of the enemy were glowing slightly. Not good. An ominous thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Dodge. The captain of the knight tried to salvage the situation at the last moment, but it was too late. All of a sudden, Karglai and his White Lion guards raised their swords and slashed in unison. They slashed in unison. A full moon of water flew out from the swords and formed a water curtain that spread forward on the long street. There was a faint flash of white light in the water curtain. It was like a perfect arc. The arc moved forward and crossed a distance of 10 meters. It was like a sparkling wave. The frontline soldiers of the White Lion Legion's 4th column fell to the ground as if they had hit an invisible wall. Moments later, they screamed in agony. Blood dyed the rain red and spread across the street. Even the stone slabs were stained with the color of blood. The White Raven Sword technique. This is impossible. No, it was earlier. This should be the sword technique of the Wind Empress, the White Lion's Fawn. Cullen's heart sank. There was an orderly clatter as the White Lion guards sheathed their large swords. The entire army was like a single entity. At that moment, the countless scenes of history began to overlap in front of the White Lion Legion like chaotic fragments. The past, the present, the legends, the stories, the glory, the victories, and the defeats. Countless memories flowed through their hearts like a quiet river. That was the White Lion Legion. But this name no longer belonged to them. It was as if there was a loud voice between heaven and earth. Today I will take your crown because you have deviated from the path of glory. It was the voice of King Eric. At the same moment, suddenly Karglai raised his head. His eyes were filled with disbelief. To be precise, everyone present stopped what they were doing. The air seemed to be filled with a heavy pressure. Even the flow of the wind and water became viscous. Everyone felt a great pressure. There was a resonance in their bodies. Swords and oaths. Resonance. With a loud bang, Forster saw a golden beam of light shoot up from the banner. In just a moment, another beam of light rose from the east. 2 beams of light intertwined in the morning sky. Foster did not speak for a long time because he knew it was the Lionheart sword. King Eric's sword. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 582. The pillars of light reflected each other in the rain. From afar, it seemed that the rain that passed through them had turned into pure gold. Everyone raised their heads. A crack appeared in the dark clouds where not a single ray of sunlight could penetrate. Pure white light descended from behind the clouds like a pair of wings, gently protecting the crowns of the people. Beams of light pierced through the clouds and fell over the harbor. Lighter Duluo stood in front of the window. The old soldier seemed to be pouring all his strength into this standing posture, standing straight. Only his hands were clenched into fists. The ancient king walked on top of the clouds, watching silently, but the descendants could only be speechless. Did the nobles of Erewhon still remember the oath engraved on the long sword? They could not answer. Sir Knight. Marquis Balta was restless. He also felt the agitation in his heart, but he was more afraid that the old knight would suddenly change his mind. Although he was already the commander of the White Lion Legion, when it came to who had more prestige in the army and who could rally the troops, it was definitely this old lion of the empire. The old man slowly turned around, his expression resolute. There was only a glimmer of light in the depths of his gray eyes, as if he was nurturing determination. He looked up and said slowly, Balta, the White Lion Legion has lost the flag in our hearts for a long time, but because of this, we cannot lose the glory of being a soldier. Today if the late king asks us for that answer, but we have already deviated from that glorious path. We can only answer your majesty with the last dignity of the kingdom's army. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death. Marquis Balta froze. He looked at the tall figure of the old knight. Outside the window, on the horizon, lightning fell in the storm. However, there was a time when he was young and frivolous. He had perseverance and ideals, but the struggle for power and court had long worn away all of these. Even he himself did not know what he had lost for all of this. At this moment he suddenly saw the young man with a spear in his hand, the flag raised high, galloping on the high ground. The spear shone, the horn sounded melodious. He had been so close to his ideals. That was the history of Erewhon. The Marquis felt his eyes moisten. He bowed deeply to his teacher with red eyes. Today he finally understood that he had finally learned the last lesson of the night. Persist. The crew's people were once glorious, a voice said quietly. But we learned to compromise. Ideals and reality are not always harmonious. A free and firm heart is certainly desirable, but a person who has achieved self-sacrifice is also worthy of respect. The owner of the voice lowered his head and bowed slightly to Lighter Dullo. The old man shook his head with red eyes and sobbed, Old friend, Wood Erewhon is bleeding. I understand. The former Archbishop of Ampere Seal was in the room. At this moment he could not help but close his eyes slightly, his expression somewhat moved. He sighed heavily. Yak built a kingdom full of heroes. I'm sorry. It was at this moment that a servant in a priest's robe suddenly pushed open the door and shouted in a panic, Lord Archbishop, they are resonating too much. We can't control it anymore. Wood did not seem to hear him. He just looked at Ampere Seal outside the window with emotion. He knew this kingdom and these people. Even at the last moment there were still people fighting for it. But whether right or wrong, at least they had courage. Compared to those cowards who hid in the dark and shivered, at least there were people who were fighting against fate. However, one day Cruz would also be at sunset, and the glory of the empire would no longer be there. What would happen then? Lord Archbishop? Do your best. They know, he'll always notice, Wood replied without looking back. He thought of the young man he saw that day and shook his head. But whether it's right or wrong, there are some things we have to do. As for the result, let's leave it to history. The light that fell between the clouds was like a big hand, and the huge pressure pinned everyone to the ground. It was the curtain call. Holding a long sword in his hand, Cullen stood in the torrential rain. He just wanted to cry to his heart's content. Perhaps he had already cried, but his tears merged with the rain. He saw with his own eyes that the golden light seemed to split the rain and fell on the army opposite. At that moment he knew that no matter the result, this would be the last performance of the kingdom's White Lion Legion. That person, he had personally handed the war flag to this legion, personally placed the laurel on their heads and personally gave them glory. But today he was standing opposite them and asking them to bow their heads and surrender. Never. Cullen raised his head, stubbornly like a child. His gaze seemed to penetrate the heavy dark clouds and see the final moment. But the child will eventually grow up, June father? Perhaps this is our answer. He gritted his teeth, tears already gushing out. My fellow comrades of the White Lion Legion, my brothers. The claws and teeth of the White Lion Legion once shone on the highlands, and we once defended the kingdom's territory, the young commander's voice roared in the wind and rain. But no matter when, no matter where, we must remember the motto of the White Lion Legion. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death do us part. The White Lion Legion will not rest until death do us part. Many soldiers cried. They suddenly realized what they were facing. What they had once yearned for, what they had persevered for, was now on the other side. They seemed to be fighting a losing battle, but the soldiers still struggled to pick up their swords. This was a choice, because that was where their honor lay. It was the courage of the White Lion Legion. Those who fight with me today will be my brothers in the future, until the end of the world. Cullen raised his sword with great difficulty, almost trembling as he roared, "Charge!" In the light, a majestic pressure pressed down on everyone, making them unable to move. But the kingdom's White Lion Legion was moving forward, as if they were crawling bit by bit. Everyone's faces were filled with determination and courage as they charged towards Brando's White Lion Legion. They were as slow as a snail, but they were unstoppable. When Carglass raised his head, he saw the scene unfolding before him. They had experienced the calamity of wolves, the trials in the Black Forest, the teachings of Brando, the most systematic elven swordsmanship, the most ancient White Lion battle tactics, and the finest White Lion armor. They were proud because they were born with it. They thought that they represented the most glorious history of the kingdom, and that they were invincible. But today they finally understood what it meant to be the soul of an army. Everyone was watching this scene, watching as Cullen and his soldiers launched the slowest charge in history. However, what awaited them wasn't mockery, but the most serious expressions of their enemies. "Your Majesty," Carglass raised his hands and shouted, "let us have a fair duel. There is no right or wrong. Let us respect each other." The light dissipated in an instant. Carglass and his men's White Lion armor was covered in a layer of golden light. The golden light was slowly receding, forming golden runes that were engraved on the armor. If Brando were here, he would have recognized the White Lion armor that had been modified by King Eric. It was the White Lion armor that existed in history. This was the recognition of the White Lion Legion. It was only at this moment that Carglass understood that they had gained the recognition of the White Lion Legion. He raised his sword as well. There was no need for him to give an order. In fact, the moment the light and the pressure disappeared, the two armies that had transcended history and the present clashed with each other. This was the most direct confrontation between the past and the present, the most direct confrontation between the two armies. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion slashed their swords at Carglass and his men's White Lion armor, but they were unable to penetrate the magical barrier. The golden light around the White Lion armor flickered slightly, and the soldiers' swords were deflected away. The White Lion armor was designed by Brando based on Maximilian's armor. The thickness of the armor was no more than 3 millimeters, but its defensive value was as high as 6. It was almost equivalent to a double-layered hinged plate armor that was more than 5 millimeters thick. This kind of plate armor had never existed on Earth. Even in Wound, a swordsman at the pinnacle of iron rank would have his mobility greatly restricted when wearing it. In fact, there were very few infantry troops that were below Tier 4 who would wear such heavy armor in battle. That was usually the choice of cavalry. The White Lion armor didn't just provide the armor's own protection. Because it was a magical armor, the wind elemental defensive spell that surrounded it also provided an additional 5 points of magical defense. Even for the kingdom's White Lion Legion, whose average strength was at the pinnacle of black iron, it would be difficult for them to break through 5 points of magical defense. However, since the decline of the royal family, the situation of the White Lion Legion was not as good as it used to be. In the past, the White Lion Legion did have a glorious period when everyone was given magical armor and enchanted swords. However, even now, only a small number of elite troops in the Legion were given magical armor. As for enchanted weapons, they were out of the question. Due to the size and material of the weapon, it was harder to enchant it than armor. Therefore it was more valuable. Erewhon, including the royal family's knight regiment, did not have any army that could afford enchanted weapons. Not to mention, the White Lion Legion's 4th Regiment was not considered an elite unit in the Legion. There were more than 200 people in the Legion, and only a few of them had magical swords. Most of them were personal items. In fact, when Cullen swung his sword at Carglass's neck, he could not help but feel bitter. The sword in his hand was a family heirloom. Although it was only a glimmering magical sword, it was at least on the level of an enchanted weapon. However, when he swung his sword, he only managed to make a deep cut on Carglass's armor. Of course, Cullen did not know that Karglai's White Lion Legion's armor was specially reinforced. He thought that everyone in the Legion had the same armor, and his heart sank. He was a silver-ranked swordsman, and yet he could not even break through Karglai's armor. If even he could not do it, the others would not be able to do it. Cullen was startled, and so was Karglais. He did not know how powerful the White Lion Legion's veterans were. Karglai's strength had reached the mid-silver rank after his experience in the Black Forest, and his White Raven sword style was far superior to Karglai's. However, Karglai's simple military sword style almost caught him off guard. It was just that the sword was too fast. It was as if the other party had guessed his intentions. He blocked the direction of his sword and slashed at his neck. If not for the White Lion Legion's armor being stronger than expected, Karglai's head would have been separated from his body. At this moment, Karglais felt the pain that Buga, the White Knight, and Ibran felt when they fought against Brando. Karglais could not help but break out in cold sweat. He was not the only one who was breaking out in cold sweat. The other youths from Tanajul were also getting more and more frightened. Although they still had the upper hand, the White Lion Legion had been losing soldiers since the beginning of the battle, while Karglai's side did not even suffer a single light injury. However, it was clear that this was not due to them. In fact, the White Lion Legion's battle armor was simply too overpowered. In fact, they were constantly being suppressed by the White Lion Legion's veterans. They almost couldn't even retaliate. However, the White Lion Legion's veterans would often slash them more than 10 times, and the White Lion Legion's armor would not be damaged at all. However, the White Lion Legion's veterans would often use the Sword of the Lion to counterattack, and the White Lion Legion soldiers would often be severely injured or killed. The veterans of the White Lion Legion did not have any fancy battle techniques. They relied on the limited acceleration provided by the defective White Lion armor to seize the opportunity to attack. Every single time, Karglais and his men would be caught off guard. However, the more Karglais fought, the more surprised he became. On the other hand, Karglais was having a hard time. No matter how much of an advantage they had, they would never be able to win. Moreover, Karglai's men were not a bunch of weaklings. Karglai's men were like rookies on the battlefield. All they lacked was experience. However, they were becoming more and more mature. Their counterattacks and defenses were becoming more and more stable. In comparison, Karglai's men had become their teachers, teaching them how to kill themselves. Karglais could not help but close his eyes in pain. Karglais could not take it anymore. He was not a fool. If this continued, they would not be able to learn anything. He was afraid that the morale of Karglai's White Lion Legion would be depleted. Although arrogance was a path to death, an army could not be without its own pride. He could not help but look at the White Lion Legion's veterans with admiration. At the same time, he gave the order, "White Lion Legion, abandon your defenses and attack with all your might." He almost roared out these words. It was somewhat laughable. Their clumsy defense was completely useless in front of the other party. Instead, it was better to simply leave the defense to the White Lion battle armor and go all out to crush the other party. Although the order sounded ridiculous, it was the best idea that Karglais could think of. It was also the most effective. The young men from Tanajul no longer panicked when they gave up their defenses. It was as if they had returned to the dark forest. Their opponents were still those terrifying monsters. They did not need to be confused anymore. All they needed to do was to muster up all their courage and charge forward like that day. That was enough. Karglais and his White Lion Legion roared in unison. They raised the Sword of the Lion in their hands and charged forward. At that moment, their training in the dark forest began to show its effects. They swung their swords at the enemies in front of them. At that moment, Karglais knew that the imminent defeat had arrived. The sword was dazzling. The White Raven sword technique's dense air blades converged together like waves in the rain, bringing with it a hazy white mist. It made one realize why it was named the White Raven. It was a flock of gray-white birds flapping their wings in the air. They flew through the crowd. Blood fell like rain. Karglais was on the verge of tears. He did not understand why he was here. Shouldn't their enemies be Cruz's men? Instead, he brought his men here, causing them to lose their lives and all their glory. But at the last moment, the White Lion Legion's fourth column burst forth with the greatest courage. They no longer retreated or defended themselves. Instead, they clashed with Karglais' men. It was no longer a battle. The soldiers of the White Lion Legion were only seeking death. Even Karglais could not bear to watch. Enough. Stop it. He stood in the heavy rain and roared like a lion, "Everyone stop." In fact, there was no need for his orders. The youths from Trendheim had already stopped one after another. Then the soldiers of the White Lion Legion also stopped. Many of them were completely covered in blood, but they were still panting and staring at their enemies, holding their weapons tightly in their hands. The streets were dyed red with blood. Both sides stood in the middle of the street. There was a moment of silence. "I don't know who you are," Karglais panted in the rain. His voice echoed in the rain. "Commander, I hope you will give us a way out. This massacre should not continue. The White Lion Legion will not retreat, even if it means dying to the last man." Karglais looked at the heavily armored commander of the White Lion Legion. He was also panting heavily, disheartened, but still determined. Karglais took a deep breath. "This is not retreating." He closed his eyes. "Do you think the White Lion Legion will continue to fight against Erwin's men? Is this where your glory lies? Why are you here? Answer me. Is it only for power and profit? No, this is not what the White Lion Legion is after. Is this what you yearn for? When you joined the glorious name of the White Lion Legion and swore to that flag, is this what you yearned for? Open your eyes and take a good look." Karglais roared. He clenched his fists. "Look at your flag, it is stained red with blood. Look at this port, it is soaked with blood. But it is the blood of Erwin's men. Listen, this is the sound of burning fire, this is the sound of the kingdom dying. Can't you hear it? This is what you swore to protect? This vast territory, this is what you swore to protect with your life. This is the homeland protected by the ancient glory." He stared at them, enunciating each word clearly. "We are killing our kingdom. So, please step aside." "Okay." With a clang, Karglais' sword fell to the ground. He saw the blood-stained flag that Karglais was pointing at. The White Lion was stained with the blood of Erwin's men. Is this what they are after? In the rain, the knight of the White Lion Legion knelt on the ground and cried. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 583. Amidst the wind and rain, a golden pillar of light pierced through the heavens and earth. It was as if a voice had been added to everyone. It said, "Your Majesty, Erwin has not been destroyed. And one day it will exist for a long time. That flag will always fly on this glorious land, long and glorious." That was the sound of the sword. Freya watched as the sword in her hand burned fiercely. Then, another pillar of light pierced through the heavens and earth. In the command center of the White Lion Legion, the captain of the guards, Forster, also watched as the flag left behind by the late King Eric ignited in flames. In an instant, a dazzling light rose from the flag. It turned into a golden shuttle and rose into the sky, but disappeared into the clouds in the blink of an eye. Forster was left dumbfounded. The flag of the White Lion Legion that had been passed down for centuries was burned to ashes in his hands right under his nose. "Brando?" Freya's voice was weak and filled with disbelief. "What's going on? The sword seems to be summoning you?" Brando did not say a word because he felt it too. The sword was summoning him. But it was not the Lionheart sword. He suppressed the shock in his heart and turned to look at the Emerald Knight beside Freya. Under the Emerald Knight's mask, sky-blue phosphorescence quietly burned in its eye sockets. It looked at him as if it wanted to see through him. "You know what's going on, don't you?" Brando could not help but roar, "The Ashen Knight Krentel." The Emerald Knight was one step behind Freya. It looked at Brando without saying a word. Because in the memories of the undead, there was only pain. But in the abyss of pain there were flashing images. The people and things in the images were so familiar, yet so unfamiliar. It was as if everything was meaningless. "Krentel, do you really want to swear an oath to protect this sword? If you swear an oath, you will never be at peace. Your soul will linger on this land, unable to rest in peace. Your Majesty, for the sake of this belief, we have long abandoned everything." The young man with long, pale blonde hair smiled and replied. The old man sighed and looked at him. "Krentel, I've separated the sword from the soul. I'll give one to you and the other to Lucan. You will protect the royal family with it, and Lucan will become the next commander of the White Lion Legion. If the nobles do as I say, one day you will leave with it and go to Randner. Until one day someone picked up my sword and remembered our oath. When that day comes, the soul of the Lionheart sword will definitely acknowledge him. Your Majesty. Krentel, you once asked me why I brought the Lionheart sword out of Cruz. The old man was silent for a moment before he suddenly replied, "Actually, I didn't choose the Lionheart sword. The Lionheart sword chose me. Your Majesty." Holy Sword Odorfice inherited the will of the Flame King, but its soul is in the Lionheart sword. His beliefs, his ideals, and everything that the people of Erwin have long forgotten. Krentel, You must never forget that the people of Erewhon are also the descendants of the Flame King. In the boundless rain, another pillar of light had disappeared forever along with the war flag of the late King Eric. However, Brando suddenly felt that there was a great soul watching him from above the clouds. It was a majestic, powerful, and noble soul. He could not help but look up. It was not the will of the late King Eric, but an even more blazing and upright law. Dark clouds were gathering there, but suddenly, a pillar of light descended from above the clouds and struck Brando between his eyebrows. Brando could not help but scream. At that moment, it was as if a flaming spear had pierced his mind, causing his entire mind to turn into a sea of fire. He felt that all the pain he had suffered before this was not even worth mentioning. His over 100 points of will was completely useless in the face of this mental torture. Brando. Freya was stunned. Everyone around was stunned. They all felt that the pillar of light that descended from the clouds was the source of the energy that surged above Ampere Seal. But it was clearly the resonance caused by the Lionheart sword in Freya's hand, so how did it end up with Brando? Wasn't this mistake a little too big? Among everyone present, only Brando, who had experienced all of this personally, completely understood why in an instant. The violent mental shock only lasted for a short while before it ended. At that moment, it was as if there were countless unfamiliar memories and knowledge in his mind. He was all too familiar with this kind of thing. Inheritance. Brando, you're... He immediately heard Orthlis's surprised and somewhat abnormal voice from the bottom of his heart. In fact, this was the first time this wind elf had woken up today. Obviously, everything that had happened before had woken her up. Brando's heart was also filled with shock. He did not have time to answer Orthlis. Instead, he immediately opened his character panel. Switching the menu to the item in his inventory, he saw that at the end of that item, there was a line of boiling hot golden words. Flaming Blade Odorfice Fragment, Soul, Divine Artifact. Martha Buff. Brando speechlessly raised his head to look at the gloomy sky. The cold sweat on his pale forehead was blown away by the wind and rain, but at this moment he finally understood. So that's why. He finally understood why the sage's slate resonated with the Lionheart sword at the divine artifact level. But the Lionheart sword was clearly a fantasy weapon. Although Bosley had explained that the Lionheart sword was a component of the Flaming Blade Odorfice, he still had doubts. Because whether or not the Lionheart sword was a component of Odorfice, when it was a component, it was still a fantasy weapon. At least in the game this was very clear. But today he finally understood. The Lionheart sword was the Lionheart sword, and it originally contained the soul of the Flaming Blade Odorfice. The two had already merged into one. And the one that resonated with him was actually the soul of the Flaming Blade Odorfice. And the one that acknowledged Freya was the Lionheart sword itself. Until today when they separated once again. Brando turned to look at Freya. The flames burning on the Lionheart sword in the future Valkyrie's hand were gradually extinguished, and the pillar of light that enveloped her body was slowly dissipating. The Lionheart sword in her hand had completely returned to its original appearance. It was exactly the same as the Lionheart sword in Brando's memory. This was the real King Eric's Lionheart sword. Congratulations, Freya. You have received the recognition of the Lionheart sword and the late King Eric. Brando smiled faintly. Now, you are the real Erewhon Valkyrie. Me? Valkyrie? Brando, what are you talking about? Freya looked at the sword in her hand, somewhat baffled. Then she looked at Brando with concern. Brando, but what's going on with your body? Do you also have a Lionheart sword? Brando looked up. In fact, after the pillar of light descended from above the clouds and hit him, it still shrouded his body at this moment. The surging magical power in the air did not weaken. Instead, it strengthened. The resonance caused by the Lionheart sword was stronger than before. Those who were slightly more sensitive to the flow of magical power could even hear the crackling sound in the air. It was as if a huge amount of power was flowing and gathering in the sky above the harbor. In the blink of an eye, a huge magical vortex was formed above the clouds. This is the true resonance of a divine artifact. A voice came from behind the two. Brando turned around and saw Maynard rushing over with a cold face. She looked at Brando and asked sternly, "You know what's going on, right?" Brando nodded. He had always thought that there should only be Coast Guards stationed at the North Gate, but when the Lionheart sword resonated, he had already realized that he was wrong. And now, everything that was happening to him was even more proof of this. Someone had leaked the news. Or rather, he had trusted the wrong person from the beginning. The White Lion Legion. Brando looked calmly at the north and answered quietly, and, in his field of vision. Suddenly, A brighter and more dazzling beam of light than before was rising in the northern sky, straight into the clouds. The moment it hit the clouds, it formed a small light spot. Then, in the blink of an eye, with a bang, the dark clouds above the entire Ampere seal were stirred up. The storm outside the harbor seemed to have been torn apart in an instant and stopped, revealing the blue skyline behind it, and above the sky, under the elemental barrier called Tiamat, a huge magic circle was slowly rotating like an endless gear. On it, complicated lines were redrawing the laws of the world little by little. It formed countless regular or irregular patterns, but finally gathered in the sky above Ampere seal, forming a giant magic circle that was so complex and mysterious that mortals would not be able to see the slightest truth in it in their lifetime. The magic circle corresponded to the whole of Ampere seal in the sky with a diameter of thousands of miles. Then the second and third beam of light lit up, and together with the fourth beam of light on Brando's body, they were completely connected to the magic circle in the sky. At this moment, everyone could only raise their heads at the same time, losing the ability to speak. Brando also raised his head, but his heart was clear. The flaming blade Oderfeis was here. Cruz's people were here too. They had finally waited for this day, the day the Lionheart sword was resurrected, the day they took back their divine artifact. They had arranged all of this a long time ago. It turned out that this was what Moros wrote in the letter to Wood. It turned out that Princess Magadal had discovered this secret. Everyone was wrong. P.S. 2 updates, 1 5400, 1 3100 in fact is almost equivalent to 3 updates, but for the sake of the continuity of the plot, I did not divide it that much. Eruption means what I say. As for what I want, you know. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 585. In the blue sky, Martha's Tiamat element resonated with the artifact. 4 pillars of light pierced through the sky, supporting the 4 corners of Ampere Seal's skyline. The sky and the sea resonated. Flocks of white birds flew up from the sea, circling the pillars of light under the clear sky, forming a magnificent picture. That day, from Ampere Seal to Sioux, from Gray Harbor to Kanaichi, countless people witnessed this miracle. However, not everyone under this miracle was in the mood to enjoy the beautiful scenery in the sky. In the streets near the north gate of Ampere Seal Port, the night officers of the Royal Night Academy were penetrating and destroying the last line of defense of the Coast Guards in an organized manner. But the situation was slowly changing. As one of the few outstanding graduates of the Royal Night Academy, Olan was leading a few other night officers to break through a temporary barricade set up by the Coast Guards. What he needed to do now was to keep moving forward and create an opening in the Coast Guard's position before the Coast Guards could retreat and form a new line of defense. Behind him, Mayor's Squad 13 and Eden's Squad 14, who had completed the joint attack with him, would continue to circle around the other lines of defense to complete the pincer attack. The responsibilities of each tactical team were clear. The owner of the Wind Spirit Spiders on their shoulders was clearly coordinating the situation of the entire battlefield through the spiders, and then relaying orders to each of them. Olan had never fought a battle like this before, nor had he learned anything about it. But there was no doubt that this was what he had been dreaming of. He could clearly see that his opponents were unable to resist and were in shock and fear. All they needed to do was to move forward, and victory would be within their grasp. It was as if they were their own arms. Olan had always thought that this was just an adjective, but now he realized that this kind of command and execution really existed. The night officers on the battlefield had truly gathered together to form a sharp sword, and the person wielding the sword was a peerless swordsman. What a satisfying battle. But suddenly, a few wind spirit spiders appeared out of thin air around him. When Olan saw these sky-blue translucent insects in the wind, he immediately knew that they were the scouts in his direction. Something went wrong. Cruz's men are already on the move, Brando replied with a serious face as if he had seen it with his own eyes. There are at least 3 or more armies moving towards our flanks from the northeast and northwest. They are moving very fast. They have passed by the Avenue of the Golden Fleece, the 12th Avenue. He suddenly raised his head. I think I recognize them. It's the White Lion Legion. This is their old trick of attacking from 2 sides. Brando suddenly found it funny. It was actually them. They want to outflank us. Maynold coldly replied, "This is a trap. Those northerners are quite brave. They attracted everyone's attention to the Black Blade Squad, but secretly mobilized the White Lion Squad." Brando sneered as he raised his head and looked at the strange phenomenon of the divine weapon resonating in the sky. It's just to satisfy Cruz's demands. He doesn't even feel the slightest bit of heartache. Everyone's face darkened. The situation now was very clear. The king's eldest son must have used the Lionheart sword as a bargaining chip to convince the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Otherwise, under the surveillance of the Kurluts, the White Lion Legion would not have been able to quietly transfer thousands of people to Ampere Seal. Not only that, Cypher had openly persuaded Cruz's men to come personally. In fact, whether the Lionheart sword appeared in Ampere Seal or not, it would belong to the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the future. With the manpower and resources of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it would be easy to find a sword in the small Erewhon. Not to mention the other party had several other parts that could resonate with the Lionheart sword. But perhaps the other party did not expect Oderfice's soul to be in the White Lion Legion all this time. Perhaps this was the so-called man proposes, God disposes. The sudden resonance of the divine weapon also reminded Brando. Would. Brando could not help but shake his head. He was still too reliant on the judgment of his previous life. That old man Wood was indeed a close friend of Tumen and was also an upright and neutral person. But other than that, he had forgotten that Wood was also a high-ranking member of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, a Kurlutzian. The importance of the flaming blade Oderfice to the Holy Cathedral of Fire was self-evident. More importantly, the Holy War was as important to him as it was to Moros. Those northerners were really patient. But unfortunately they gave him a last chance. The resonance of the divine weapon had exposed his position, but it also exposed the other party's intentions. Brando could not help but be sarcastic. The Holy Cathedral of Fire still did not understand that the battlefield was already under his control. Soon the other party would regret it. He turned around. Maynard, please order the army to turn around. This is our last chance. The female knight looked up and glanced at him. She nodded silently. The sound of a horn could be heard. Alon tightened his grip on the reins. He could already hear the sound of the horn echoing in the air. This was not an attack but a retreat. But now he had no choice. He saw the soldiers in grayish-white armor pouring out from the alleys in front and behind him. The kingdom's White Lion Legion. Alon felt his heart tighten, but he reacted quickly. It's an ambush. Go into that alley. At this time, the 5 NCOs and knights displayed exquisite coordination. They pulled on the reins at the same time, turned around and clamped on the horse's belly at the same time. Then they turned around and jumped into the side of the alley. Faster. Faster. Don't stop. But soon Olan saw the same soldiers appear at the other end of the alley. They seemed to be heavy infantry and there were 2 rows of about 10 of them. He immediately shouted, "The White Lion Legion is infantry. Speed up, charge through them." But the White Lion Legion reacted quickly. As soon as they appeared at the entrance of the alley, they set up tower shields in front and spears in the back. The spears they were using were the special equipment of the White Lion Legion. They were modified from the Wind Elves' dragon-slaying spears, and were very effective against cavalry. Alon's heart sank. The enemy's tactics were too good. He wished he was riding on Cruz's dragon. Only the dragon's armor plate, which was more than 7 millimeters thick, could withstand a blow from the White Lion Legion's spears. He turned around and saw the White Lion Legion charging into the alley. The one leading the charge was a White Lion Legion with a heavy shield in one hand and a battle axe in the other. The White Lion Legion's light infantry had already raised their longbows. Olan finally realized that the rain had stopped, and the projectile weapons were finally put to use. This was one disaster after another. Olan turned around and squinted his eyes. The rows of White Lion Legion spears were getting closer and closer. The patterns on the spears were clear, but they were slightly different from the ones he saw in the north. Did the White Lion Legion improve their weapons again? The White Lion Legion was indeed the best in the kingdom. But they were not inferior to the White Lion Legion in any way. It was just that they were at a great disadvantage. Let's make a last stand. Olan tightened his grip on his sword. The White Lion light infantry behind him had already let go of their bowstrings. The sharp sound of arrows piercing through the air could be heard from afar. Then Olan felt a few heavy impacts on his back. It hurt a little, but fortunately he did not wear it. But his aim was terrible. He was glad that the White Lion Legion was not known for their long-range attacks. Olan had regretted this more than once, but now that the White Lion Legion was on his opposite side, he was glad that he did not jinx it. But the spears were getting closer and closer. Put in more effort, brothers. He suddenly raised the sword in his hand and roared with all his remaining strength. For Erewhon, forward. The knight beside him roared. But at that moment Olan heard a faint voice shouting, "Split up! Split up! Split up what?" He was stunned. Suddenly he saw the White Lion Legion's light infantry moving to the sides, creating a gap in the middle. Chance. Olan was like a drowning man who had found a straw. He immediately screamed like the knight who had charged at the enemy during the Battle of Grimoires. Charge! Charge! No one wanted to die if they could. The officers were the same. Although they did not understand why the White Lion Legion had given them a chance, they had no other choice. The 5 war horses and the knight on their backs passed through the White Lion Legion's spear formation in an instant. Olan turned around and saw the spear formation closing up behind them. Then he saw the White Lion Legion's light infantry on the other side of the alley. They were drawing their bows again and releasing arrows. When he saw the sharp arrows leave the bowstrings, he suddenly realized something. It was not that the White Lion Legion's aim was bad. They were aiming at the White Lion Legion's light infantry. What was going on? Had the White Lion Legion split up? Alan's mind was in a mess. Then he heard a voice calling out to him. Alan? He turned around and saw a large group of students from the Royal Cavalry Academy gathered together, forming a torrent of cavalry. The female knight on horseback stared at him and shouted, Olan, get back to the team. We don't have time to talk, we have to break through to the south. Bess? What's going on here? Olan looked back at the White Lion Legion's light infantry. They were fighting with their comrades, but to his surprise, the White Lion Legion's light infantry were no match for the light infantry that had appeared later. When he saw the White Lion infantrymen blocking the entrance of the alleyway, he couldn't help but change his expression. White Raven Swordsmanship. Could it be that these are the Royal Guards? No, I don't know. Bess shook her head. They're here to help us, but I don't know what's going on. She tilted her head. If you have any questions, you can ask the commander. Commander? Olan turned around on his horse and immediately saw a slender figure standing upright on a warhorse. He could not help but look in that direction with reverence. Is that also the commander's army? It seems so. But how can he command the White Lion Legion? No, Olan. They're not the White Lion Legion. In fact, they're... The White Lion Legion. The half-elf princess froze in place. She watched as the army walked out of the heavy rain and arrived in front of her. They then passed through her troops and entered the front line of the battlefield. Her fingertips had turned white and were even trembling slightly. Countless times she had heard her father talk about this army in bedtime stories. They wore pure white armor and fought alongside the late king in the plains, mountains and forests of Erewhon. They defeated all their enemies and expanded their territory. They walked with virtue and valor. They were the strongest army that truly belonged to Erewhon. The White Lion Legion. Countless times she saw the shining flag in her dreams. Under the lead of her knight it came to her. And that glorious army seemed to have returned to Erewhon and returned to the flag. Countless times she even thought that her father was still alive in this world and could see her achieve everything with his own eyes. Countless times she believed that she could succeed. Until her father, who had always supported her, left her. Until the royal faction parted ways with her ideals. But today her dreams had become reality. The flag was right in front of her. Behind Brando. That army was currently walking under the flag. They were clad in pure white armor, and golden battle flags were engraved on their armor. There was not the slightest difference. When she saw that the army had defeated the White Lion Legion's attack, the half-fairy princess could not help but look up at the sky. At that moment she seemed to have seen the wise eyes that had transcended time. Brando did not expect that the army he had built with his own hands would have such a great impact on the princess. But how could he not be the same? Recreating this army was one of his dreams. But when he saw the birth of this army with his own eyes, he realized that his efforts had not been in vain. The ancient army had returned. It was as if the king had personally handed it to him. Only Erewhon's people could understand the meaning behind it. But Brando knew that this was not the time to be sentimental. The White Lion Legion was still preparing to complete the encirclement. He only had one chance. He had to break out of the encirclement. He had to take everyone with him. He glanced around. The Knight Academy students had already gathered. These young people did not suffer any losses in the battle against the Coast Guards. But when the White Lion Legion attacked, almost 1/10 of them would be forever left on the battlefield. They were still too young. Brando's heart ached so much that he could barely speak. Fortunately, most of the heroes in history were fine. Only a few of them were slightly injured. The funniest thing was that Enrique actually fell off his horse when he broke through the White Lion Legion's blockade and was crushed to death. If not for his companions who came to his rescue, he would probably have become a captive. Thank goodness. Brando turned around and gave Carglass a look. The current commander of the new White Lion Legion immediately nodded. Brando wanted the new White Lion Legion to protect the students on both sides. This did not mean that he did not care about the lives of the new White Lion Legion. It was because he believed that there was no possibility of these young people from Tanajil dying. Everything was arranged properly. The new White Lion Legion and the Royal Cavalry Academy's cadets were indeed Aween's most outstanding troops in this era. It took less than a quarter of an hour for the two armies to merge and turn around. Brando raised his sword. He looked proudly at the White Lion Legion in the distance. Finally, his battle plan was going to be realized. He would let the White Lion Legion be the first test subject. Although it was not complete, it was enough to give some people a hard time. Everyone looked up at the Haurangaya that was pointed to the sky. At that moment, a golden halo spread out from Brando's body. Conflict Halo. Brando put down his sword and pointed forward. Charge. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.